Colonel Harlan Price snatched the headset directly out of Evelyn Carter's hands. "You are done," he said, his face 2 inches from hers. "You are a file clerk. You do not touch my equipment." He shoved her toward the door with one hand. Behind him on the radar screen, the F-18 was falling. Ryan Mitchell's voice cracked through the speaker. "Ghost, Ghost, where did you go? I need you. Ghost, please." Price reached for the frequency dial. He was going to cut the channel. "I was going to let that pilot die, rather than admit that the most important person in that room had been sitting behind a forgotten desk for 7 years. Before we go any further, if this story is already pulling you in, please take 2 seconds and hit that subscribe button right now. Every week we bring you real stories about extraordinary people who lived quiet lives but carried extraordinary souls. Drop a comment below and tell me what city you are watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning, because what you just saw was not where this story starts. It starts 7 years earlier in a small office at the edge of Falcon Ridge Air Station with a woman who had decided the world was done with her. The office was barely large enough to hold a desk and a filing cabinet. There was one window and it looked out at the flight line at the gray tarmac where F-18 Super Hornets lined up in the early morning light like sleeping giants waiting to be woken. Evelyn Carter had requested that window. Not because she wanted to watch the planes. She had made a very careful and deliberate decision never to watch the planes. She had requested the window because she needed to feel the direction of the wind. Old habits, she told herself, just old habits. Every morning, Evelyn arrived at her desk at 6:45, 15 minutes before anyone else, and she made her coffee, black no sugar, and she sat down and she opened the first file of the day. Maintenance logs, flight records, radar correction data. The kind of work that kept the Air Force running, but that nobody ever talked about at dinner. Nobody ever told their children about the woman who caught a transcription error in a radar log and prevented a navigational discrepancy that could have sent a training flight 6 miles off course. Nobody wrote stories about that, and that was exactly what Evelyn Carter wanted. She was 48 years old. She walked with a slight stiffness in her left hip that got worse in cold weather. She kept her dark brown hair threaded now with silver pulled back in a practical knot at the base of her neck. She wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and she had a habit of folding them and pressing the frames against her lips when she was thinking through a difficult problem. The younger pilots called her Miss Carter. Not Captain Carter, not ma'am, not ghost, just Miss Carter. The kind of name you gave someone who brought donuts to the morning briefing and remembered everyone's birthdays and never ever asked for anything in return. She had been at Falcon Ridge for 6 years and 11 months when the morning happened. 6 years and 11 months of files and coffee and the sound of jets she never watched. Lieutenant Ryan Mitchell was 26 years old and had been flying F-18s for 14 months. He was talented, everyone said so. His instructors said he had instincts that couldn't be taught a feel for the aircraft, that most pilots only developed after a decade of flight hours. He was the kind of pilot who made difficult maneuvers look effortless, who talked in the ready room with the casual confidence of someone who had never seriously believed that the sky might one day refuse him. He had heard the name Ghost exactly once. It was during his second month at Falcon Ridge during one of those late-night sessions in the pilot lounge where the senior guys told stories. Old Lieutenant Colonel Vasquez, a weathered man with a voice like gravel and 2 decades of carrier landings behind him, had mentioned the name almost as an afterthought. "There was a pilot once," Vasquez had said, not looking at anyone in particular, just staring at the ceiling with his arms folded behind his head. "Call sign Ghost, best emergency pilot I ever heard of. Not the fastest, not the flashiest, but if you were falling out of the sky and you had one phone call to make you called Ghost." "What happened to them?" someone had asked. "Her," Vasquez said. "Ghost was a her. And that's the thing about the good ones, they burn bright and then the sky takes something from them and they disappear. Last I heard she was somewhere doing paperwork." He shook his head slowly. "Waste of a mind like that, absolute waste." Ryan had nodded along with everyone else and then forgotten the story entirely. He had his own future to think about. I was not the kind of young man who spent much time thinking about the people sitting behind desks. The Nevada desert in November carried a particular kind of cold, dry, and sharp cutting through flight suits at the joints, making the fingers stiff inside gloves. It was the kind of morning that reminded pilots that the desert was not a friendly place, regardless of how many times they flew over it. Bravo flight that morning consisted of 4 F-18 Super Hornets conducting a standard combat training exercise over the Nevada mountain range. Routine, the kind of mission that pilots could practically fly in their sleep after enough repetitions. Ryan was flying Hornet 3. He was at 23,000 feet moving through a simulated intercept maneuver when he noticed something wrong. Not wrong in a dramatic way. Not wrong the way it happened in movies with alarms screaming and warning lights blazing red across every panel. It was wrong in the quiet way that experienced pilots learn to fear far more than noise. A subtle hesitation in the engine response when he adjusted throttle. A sensation in the airframe that didn't match what the instruments were telling him. He checked his panel. Everything read normal. He adjusted throttle again. The hesitation was still there. Hornet flight, this is Hornet 3, he said, keeping his voice level. I'm getting an unusual response in my engine feed. Keeping an eye on it. Copy Hornet 3, came the reply from the flight leader, Captain Torres. Report if it changes. Changes, and it changed. 3 minutes and 40 seconds later, both engines flamed out simultaneously. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Ryan Mitchell had ever experienced in his life. There is a particular quality to the silence inside a fighter cockpit when both engines die. It is not peaceful. It is the silence of a machine that has forgotten what it was built to do. The vibration that a pilot feels through the seat, in the stick, in the rudder pedals, that constant, subtle, alive vibration that tells the body everything is working, simply stops. And the aircraft, which has been a living thing, responding to every input with power and precision, becomes suddenly something much more fundamental. It becomes a very expensive, very aerodynamic rock. And rocks do not fly. Ryan Mitchell had trained for this. Every fighter pilot trained for this. But training was something that happened at a controlled altitude with instructors watching and an ejection seat as the final answer if everything went wrong. This was 22,000 feet over the Nevada mountains, with 2 dead engines and the ground rising to meet him, and the knowledge immediate and absolute and terrifying that he had a very limited window to solve an unsolvable problem. Mayday, mayday, mayday. His voice was controlled. They trained you for that too. Keep the voice level. Keep the transmission clear. Falcon Ridge, this is Hornet 3. Both engines flamed out. I'm at 22,000 feet and descending. I need immediate assistance. The response from the control room came back fast, but Ryan could already hear something underneath the professional calm, the particular tension of people realizing that the routine morning had just become something else entirely. Hornet 3 Falcon Ridge copies. Confirm both engines out. Confirmed both engines out. I am attempting restart procedures. He ran the restart checklist. The engines did not restart. Falcon Ridge restart unsuccessful. I need options. What he heard next in the control room, though he could not see it, was every trained controller in the room looking at each other and then looking at their screens, running calculations that were telling them things they did not want to be true. Inside the Falcon Ridge Air Station control room, the atmosphere shifted in the way it only shifted during real emergencies. Not the practiced urgency of drills, but the genuine, slightly nauseating weight of understanding that something was actually going wrong. Senior Controller Sergeant Diana Okafor pulled up Ryan's radar track and felt her stomach tighten. He's descending at approximately 4,000 feet per minute, she said, her voice professionally flat. At his current position and descent rate she did a rapid calculation, maybe 14-15 minutes before he reaches minimum safe altitude for ejection. Captain Jim Holloway, the duty officer, was already on the radio to base operations. Get me Colonel Reed, now. Colonel Reed is en route, someone confirmed. What's his runway options? Falcon Ridge is the closest. Okafor did another calculation, and this time her voice didn't quite stay as flat as she intended. He's going to be very tight. If he loses much more altitude before he starts his approach, can he make it? She looked at the screen. She looked at the numbers. And she did the thing that good controllers always did when the numbers were bad. She told the truth. If everything goes perfectly, she said carefully, maybe. What does everything going perfectly require? It requires someone who knows exactly how to fly a dead F-18 all the way to the runway without a single mistake. She paused. We don't have a simulator procedure for this exact scenario. The room was quiet for half a second, the kind of quiet that happened when professionals understood a problem was beyond the edge of their training. And that was the moment that the door opened. Colonel Marcus Reed had been the base commander at Falcon Ridge for 3 years. He was 53 years old with the kind of career that had taken him through 2 combat deployments, in a posting at the Pentagon, and a decade of commanding pilots who were faster and more aggressive than he had ever been. He was a good commander because he understood one thing that many commanders never learn. The most important skill in a crisis was not knowing all the answers. It was knowing who in the room had the answer you needed. He walked into the control room and got the situation briefed to him in 45 seconds by Okafor, who was crisp and efficient and didn't waste a single word. He looked at the radar track. He looked at the numbers. And then he said the thing that nobody expected him to say. "Get me the personnel file for the civilian specialist in flight records. The woman. Carter." Everyone in the room turned to look at him. "Sir," Holloway said carefully. "Evelyn Carter." Reed said her name like he was placing a bet. "She was Air Force, fighter pilot, emergency landing specialist. Before your time here, before my time here. I heard about her when I was at Edwards 3 years ago. One of the instructors mentioned her name in the context of exactly this kind of scenario." He was already looking around the room. "Where is she right now?" "Sir, she's a civilian administrative." "I know what her current position is, Captain. Where is she physically located right now?" Evelyn Carter was on her 3rd cup of coffee and her 2nd file of maintenance records when she heard the sound change. The control room was 30 feet down the corridor from her office, separated by a thin wall and a door that was usually closed. She could not hear specific words, but she had spent enough years around operations centers that she had developed the same sensitivity to the rhythm of professional radio communication that a musician develops for the rhythm of a familiar piece of music. And right now, the rhythm was wrong. She put down her coffee. She took off her reading glasses. She listened. The rhythm of the radio traffic coming through that thin wall was the rhythm of real emergency, not drills, not exercises. The cadence of voices trying to stay controlled when something inside them was not quite controlled. The particular spacing between transmissions that happened when people were calculating instead of simply responding. She had heard that rhythm before. She had been on the other end of it. She stood up from her desk, and something happened in her body that she had not expected, something that she had believed was no longer possible. Because for 6 years and 11 months, she had sat behind that desk and listened to jets take off and land, and she had felt the weight of what she could no longer do pressing on her chest like a stone. She had accepted it. She had made her peace with it, or something she told herself was peace. But the moment she stood up and faced the door, the stone was gone, and in its place was something much older and much more familiar. Focus. She walked to the door and opened it. She pushed open the control room door and walked in without knocking. Nobody stopped her, not because they weren't surprised they were, but because there was something about the way she moved that made stopping her feel like an incorrect instinct. The slight stiffness in her hip was still there. The reading glasses were still on the chain around her neck. She looked exactly like the woman who processed maintenance files and remembered birthdays, except for her eyes. Sergeant Okafor would describe it later as the moment she understood that she had been working next to someone for 6 years and had never actually seen them. Colonel Reed met her at the door. "Carter," he said, "Sir?" And then without preamble, without any of the social negotiation that the situation might otherwise have called for, "What's his altitude?" 18,000 and falling, both engines out. He's approximately 64 nautical miles from the runway. She walked past Reed to the radar screen. She looked at it for 11 seconds, just stood there and looked with the reading glasses dangling from her fingers now, and her head tilted very slightly, the way people tilted their heads when they were not seeing a picture but running a calculation. "What's the wind at altitude?" Okafor checked. "Northwest at 12 knots, gusting to 18. Fuel state. Tanks are still full. He just went up." Evelyn pressed her lips together. "Full tanks are dead weight. He needs to dump fuel if he can." She looked at Reed. "Can he dump? F-18 doesn't have a fuel dump system." "Then he's carrying the weight." She calculated again. Something moved in her face, not alarm, but a kind of focused intensity that settled into her expression like a mask being taken off rather than put on. "He needs to adjust his glide angle at exactly the right moment, or he will be short of the runway by approximately 1 mile. She paused. 1 mile short in a dead F-18 means he ejects or he hits the desert floor. The room had gone quiet in a way that it had not been quiet before, not the quiet of people waiting for a procedure to work, but the quiet of people watching someone else understand a problem in a way they could not. Reed looked at her. Can you talk him in? She looked at the radar track one more time, and then she held out her hand. Give me the headset. There was a moment, brief but real, when the young controllers hesitated. It was not malicious. It was the automatic biological hesitation of people whose training had given them a clear hierarchy of authority, and the hierarchy they had been operating within for years did not have a civilian file specialist at the top of it. Their eyes went to Holloway. Holloway looked at Reed, and Reed made the decision that he would later say was the easiest decision of his career. Give her the headset. Okafor handed it across. Evelyn seated it over her ears with the practiced efficiency of someone who had worn a headset 10,000 times. She adjusted the mic without looking at it. She pulled a chair close to the radar screen, but did not sit down. She stood slightly, leaning one hand on the edge of the console. Not tense, settled. Hornet 3, she said. This is Falcon Ridge. I'm calling sign Ghost. I hear you. The pause on the other end lasted approximately 2 seconds, which in an emergency radio transmission is an eternity. Then Ryan Mitchell's voice came back, and something in it had changed. He had been professional. He had been trained. He had been following a procedure with the grim concentration of a pilot who understood the arithmetic of his situation and was refusing to let the arithmetic break him. But underneath all of it, he had been alone. And suddenly he was not. Ghost, his voice broke on the word, not breaking down, breaking open. Ghost is that, they told me you were, are you real? Evelyn almost smiled. I'm real, she said. Give me your altitude and airspeed. 15,200, airspeed 208 knots. I've got the aircraft is handling its just without power. I can feel every gust, and I keep wanting to fight it, and I know I shouldn't fight it, but Ryan. She said his name the way experienced pilots said names in emergencies, not gentle, not hard, but grounded. Present. The voice of someone who was standing next to you even from 60 miles away. Stop talking for 1 second and listen to me. Silence. The aircraft is not fighting you, she said. You are fighting the aircraft. Do you feel the difference? Another pause. And then quietly, yes. Good. That's the first thing. You stop fighting and it stops fighting. You are in a glide. A glide is a controlled thing. You understand? Yes, Ghost. Tell me what you see outside your canopy right now. Mountains, desert. The sun is low. It's in my left eye. Good. The sun is northwest. That puts your nose southeast, which is where you want it. Do not change your heading unless I tell you to. Do you copy? Copy, Ghost. In the control room, nobody spoke. Nobody moved toward their other stations. Every person in that room was listening to the voice of the woman they had ignored for nearly 7 years and understanding with a clarity that would stay with them for the rest of their professional lives that they had been working next to something extraordinary and had simply never known to look. While one part of Evelyn's mind was processing Ryan's radar track and calculating descent angles in airspeed in the subtle interplay of wind and aircraft weight, another part, the part she had spent nearly 7 years trying to quiet, was remembering. She remembered what it felt like. Not in a cinematic way, not in the way of stories where memories arrive, like perfect films playing on an internal screen. She remembered it in the body and the particular quality of stillness that settled over the hands and the forearms when the engine stopped. In the way the aircraft suddenly felt both very large and very fragile at the same time. In the specific calibration required to not overcorrect to resist the screaming instinct to pull and push and force the machine into doing what it no longer had the power to do. She had been at 31,000 feet. She had been alone. And there had been nobody on the radio who understood what she was experiencing. She was not going to let that happen to this kid. Hornet 3, she said, keeping her voice in that same calibrated register, not soft but human. You are going to hear me giving numbers to the controllers in here. Don't let those numbers rattle you. Numbers are just information. The aircraft is still flying. You copy, copy. What's your breathing like right now? A beat. It's fast. Slow it down. I'm serious, Ryan. That is not a metaphor. Slow your breathing down. Fast breathing changes your perception of time, and it makes you overcorrect. Right now, I need your hands to be slower than your brain. Can you do that? She could hear him working on it over the open channel. The sound of a young man learning something in the hardest classroom available. Better, he said. Good. She looked at the radar screen. Here's what's happening. You are 61 nautical miles from the runway. At your current glide ratio, you are going to be slightly short unless we make one adjustment. I'm going to tell you exactly when to make that adjustment and exactly how much. But not yet. Right now, your only job is to maintain glide speed and heading. You understand? Maintain glide speed and heading. Copy. Tell me your exact airspeed. 202 knots. Good. Keep it there. If it drops below 190, I want to hear your voice immediately. Not after you think about it, immediately. Understood, Ghost. Okafor leaned close and said quietly, he's at 14,000. Descent rate is approximately 3,800 feet per minute. Evelyn did the math. She had been doing the math continuously since she looked at the screen. The math was not good and she knew it, and the fact that she knew it and was not letting it into her voice was perhaps the most significant professional skill she had ever developed. Okay, she said, to the room, not to the radio. Here's where we are. He has approximately 11 minutes before he reaches 5,000 feet, which is my minimum floor for this approach. At his current descent rate and the wind conditions, if he maintains 202 knots, he is going to be arriving at the runway threshold at approximately 800 feet. That is the minimum workable altitude for a clean touchdown without power. 800 feet is tight, Holloway said. 800 feet is what we have. She looked at the radar screen. Get me updated wind readings every 90 seconds. If the wind shifts more than 5 degrees or increases more than 3 knots, I need to know immediately. She pressed the transmit button. Hornet 3, you're doing exactly right. I'm watching your track, and you are exactly where I want you. Let me ask you something. Go ahead, Ghost. When you were in flight school, who was your instructor? It was not the question Ryan expected. He paused. Lieutenant Commander Bridges, ma'am. Was Bridges a good instructor? Another pause, this one with a thread of something almost like confusion. Yes, one of the best I had. What did Bridges tell you about dead stick landings? That the aircraft was still your friend, that you were still flying even without power, that most pilots who died in power-off situations died because they stopped believing they could fly and started believing they were falling. Bridges was right, Evelyn said. I want you to remember that right now. You are not falling, you are flying. Say that back to me. A moment, then with a firmness that had not been in his voice 2 minutes ago, I am not falling, I am flying. Good, hold that thought. I'll be right back. She muted the transmission and turned to Reed. He's going to make it, she said quietly, but I need everyone in this room who is not directly assisting this approach to step back from their stations and give me space. Not because I don't trust them, because the radio frequency needs to be clean and I need everyone's energy going in one direction. Reed looked at her for 1 second. Then he turned to the room. You heard her. The control room rearranged itself around her. Controllers who weren't directly involved in the approach stepped back from their primary stations. A few of them walked to the back wall and stood there watching. The room became quieter, and Evelyn Carter stood at the radar screen and carried 14 years of silence. Not because she had chosen silence out of cowardice, not because she had given up. She had chosen silence because the alternative, walking around Falcon Ridge Air Station carrying the weight of who she had been, felt like a kind of vanity that she didn't have any use for. The Air Force had taken her flying career, and she had accepted all that. She had built a new kind of usefulness, and she had been good at it, and she had told herself every morning that it was enough. But standing here now with a 26-year-old pilot's life running through the calculations in her head, she understood something that she had been refusing to understand for nearly 7 years. Some knowledge could not be filed away. Some skills did not retire just because their owner stopped using them. And some debts, the debts owed to the sky for what it had taught, you could not be paid with maintenance logs. Ghost, Ryan's voice came through the headset, and she heard the first real edge of fear in it, not panic, but the genuine, undefended fear of someone who had just done a calculation they didn't like. I'm here, she said immediately. I just ran through the numbers again. I'm going to be Ghost. I don't think I'm going to make the runway. I know what your numbers say, she said. I'm looking at different numbers. My numbers say you're going to make it. Ghost. Ryan. Her voice was firm, not harsh firm, the firmness of someone who needed him to hear the difference between their panic and her certainty. I have been doing this calculation since the moment you called Mayday. I have accounted for your fuel weight, your glide ratio, the wind gradient at each altitude, and the drag coefficient on your airframe. I have not lied to a pilot on an emergency channel in my entire career, and I am not starting today. You are going to make the runway. Silence. But, she continued, I need you to do something very precise in approximately 4 minutes and 12 seconds, and I need you to trust me completely when I give you that instruction. Can you do that? The pause was shorter this time. Yes, Ghost. I can do that. Good. She looked at the radar screen. 12,000 feet. The runway was 47 nautical miles away. The numbers were tight, and she knew exactly how tight they were. And she also knew something that the raw numbers did not capture. She knew exactly what this aircraft could do when its pilot stopped fighting it. She had done this herself, not in training, in the real sky, on a day that ended her flying career and began the long silence. And the memory of that day, which she had carried for 7 years, like a stone that had slowly become invisible, because she had stopped looking at it, surfaced now not as grief but as data, as knowledge earned in the hardest possible classroom by a student who had survived when the curriculum said she shouldn't have. She knew what this aircraft could do. She knew what this pilot could do. She was going to get him home. Colonel Harlan Price had been at Falcon Ridge for 8 months. He had arrived from a posting at a fighter wing in Virginia, where he had built a reputation as a precise and demanding administrator, the kind of officer who believed that standards were non-negotiable and that sentiment was a liability in military operations. He had not met Evelyn Carter in any formal capacity. He knew her as a civilian specialist in flight records who submitted clean paperwork, and that was the beginning and end of what he needed to know about her. When his aide told him that a civilian file clerk was currently running an emergency approach in the main control room, he said, "That's not possible." And then when his aide confirmed it, he said, "On whose authority?" And when he was told Colonel Reed had authorized it, he picked up his phone. Reed's phone went unanswered. Price walked from his office building across the tarmac to the operations building, and he walked fast because this was the kind of deviation from procedure that made his chest tight with a very particular anxiety. The anxiety of a man who had built his professional identity on the correct application of correct procedures and who understood correctly that correct procedures existed for very good reasons. He pushed open the operations building door. He heard Evelyn's voice, and he stopped, not because of what she said. He couldn't yet hear the specific words. He stopped because of the quality of the voice, the same quality that had stopped Okafor and stopped Holloway and stopped every person in that control room. The quality of absolute competent certainty that only existed in people who had earned it in a very specific and irreplaceable way. He listened for 30 seconds. Then he walked to the control room door and looked through the window. He saw the radar screen. He saw the track of the descending F-18. He saw the woman in reading glasses standing at the console like someone who had been standing at that console for decades, which in a certain sense she had. He pushed open the door. Reed was at the back of the room. He saw Price immediately and moved to intercept him, and the two men had a conversation in very quiet voices near the back wall. "You put a civilian in charge of an emergency approach," Price said. "I put the most qualified person in the building in charge of an emergency approach." Reed said, "She is not certified for. She is the most experienced emergency landing specialist on this base, possibly in this command." Reed kept his voice flat. "My pilot has 14 minutes. You can file a complaint when he's on the ground." Price looked at Evelyn's back. He looked at the radar screen, and he did something that was for him very difficult. He was quiet. "Hornet 3, give me altitude and airspeed. 10,800, airspeed 204 knots. Evelyn did the calculation in real time, 32 nautical miles to the runway. Current glide ratio was holding. Wind at altitude had been steady for the last 4 minutes, which was the element she had been most anxious about. "You're doing beautifully," she said. "I need you to make a very small adjustment. I mean very small. I want you to reduce your airspeed by 6 knots. Not 8, not 5, 6. You're going to feel like you want to adjust more. Do not. 6 knots and then hold. 6 knots reduction. Copy." She watched the radar track. "Airspeed 201, no give me 202, he said, and she could hear him working it, the precise micro-corrections of a pilot who was learning in real time how sensitive the aircraft was without power. The track held. "Perfect," she said, And she meant it not as encouragement, not as the performance of confidence, but as a factual assessment. What he had just done with that airspeed correction was precise and clean and exactly right. Ryan, I want you to know something. That correction you just made, that was excellent work. A beat. Thank you, Ghost. Don't thank me yet. You have 8 minutes to go, and I'm about to make your life a little more complicated. She heard something in the channel that might have been a short, involuntary laugh. Under the circumstances, she considered it a victory. Tell me about the runway at Falcon Ridge, she said. Describe it to me. Runway 02, he said immediately. 12,000 feet concrete. The approach end has a slight upslope in the first. Good, that upslope is your friend today. Tell me why. A pause. She could feel him thinking, which was exactly what she wanted. She wanted his mind working, engaged, analyzing, because a thinking pilot was a living pilot. Because if I'm short, the upslope gives me additional distance before the edge. And the upslope means the effective touchdown zone is lower than the nominal threshold altitude, which means I have more margin at the threshold than the raw numbers suggest. Exactly right, as she said. I want you to keep that in your head. The numbers say tight. The reality is slightly better than the numbers. You understand the difference. I understand. Good. Now, 7 minutes and 30 seconds from now, I am going to give you an instruction, and it is going to feel wrong. I need you to trust that it is right. Can you bank that trust in advance? Ryan was quiet for 3 full seconds. Ghost, I heard a story about you when I was new here. An instructor talked about a pilot who could do impossible things. I didn't really believe it. Another pause. I believe it now. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, save the stories for after the landing, Lieutenant. Right now, just fly. Outside the operations building, word had spread. The way word always spread on a military base, not through formal announcement, but through the particular telecommunications network that existed between human beings who worked in close proximity and understood that significant things were happening. The crew chief who overheard a radio call and told the maintenance sergeant, who told the line crew, who told the fuel technicians, who were suddenly all looking at the same patch of sky. Pilots who were not scheduled to fly that morning had drifted to windows and doorways. Nobody spoke much. There was nothing to do but wait. And in the middle of all of that waiting, in the memory of several people who would talk about this day for years, someone said, "Is it true that it's the lady from the records office?" And someone else who had been in the control room briefly and had come back out to make a phone call said, "It's Carter." And the first person said, "The file clerk," and the second person paused before answering because they were searching for the right words, and the right words were taking a moment to arrive. "She's not a file clerk," they finally said. She was never a file clerk. With 4 minutes remaining, Evelyn was doing something that nobody in the control room could see. She was managing her own fear. Not fear for herself. She was standing in a building on the ground and nothing could hurt her here. The fear she was managing was the fear that belonged to the memory of her own final flight, the memory she had unlocked when she picked up that headset and which was now running in parallel with the present moment like an unwanted second screen. She remembered the numbers from that day. She remembered how the calculations had looked identical to Ryan's current situation and how she had made the same adjustments she was now instructing him to make, and how the adjustments had worked until they hadn't, until the aircraft had given her one final unexpected failure that the calculations hadn't predicted, and she had survived it at the cost of the flying career she had spent her entire life building. She could not let that memory into her voice. She could not let it into her hands. She kept her breathing even. She kept her eyes on the radar screen. She kept her mind in the calculation and not in the memory, which was one of the hardest things she had done since the day she landed behind a desk and told herself she was fine. Hornet 3, 6,000 feet, 22 miles. Talk to me. I'm here, Ghost. I'm here. Ryan's voice was steady now in a way it had not been at the beginning, not the brittle steadiness of someone forcing control, but the genuine steadiness of someone who had found their feet under them. I can see the ground. I can see the desert. It's a lot of desert. Don't look at the desert, she said. Look at the runway. Can you see it yet? No, not yet. You will in 90 seconds. When you see it, don't reach for it. Don't try to fly to it. Just note it and keep flying the way I told you to fly. The runway will come to you. You understand? The runway will come to me. Say it like you believe it. A brief pause. Then with something that sounded very much like belief, the runway will come to me. Good, Evelyn said. And she let herself for just one fraction of a moment feel something that was not calculation. Something that was older and simpler and harder to name. She let herself want him to make it. Not as an outcome, not as a metric, as a person. She let herself want this young man to land his aircraft and walk out of it and go back to whatever his life was. The people he loved, the mornings he hadn't yet lived, the landings he hadn't yet made. And then she put that feeling away because it belonged after the landing and they weren't there yet. Hornet 3, she said, in 90 seconds I'm going to give you the instruction that I warned you about. The one that will feel wrong. I'm ready, Ghost. I know you are, she said. I know you are. The radar track descended, the runway waited, and in the silence between transmissions in the control room at Falcon Ridge Air Station on a cold November morning in Nevada, every person in the room understood that they were watching something that they would describe to other people for the rest of their lives, not because of the aircraft and not because of the emergency, but because of the woman at the radar screen. The woman nobody had noticed, the woman who had been there the whole time. Ghost Price's fingers were on the frequency dial, and Sergeant Diana Okafor stepped in front of him. She was 5'4", 29 years old, and had been in the United States Air Force for 8 years. She had never in her career physically blocked a superior officer from operating equipment. She had never raised her voice to a colonel. She had never done anything that could be described as insubordination in any form. She did all three in the next 4 seconds. Sir, her body was between Price and the console. Sir, you cannot cut that frequency. Price stared at her. Sergeant, move. That pilot is at 7,000 feet with no engines, and he is talking to the only person in this building who can get him down. If you cut that channel, he dies. Her voice did not shake. It was the most terrifying thing she had ever said in her life, and she said it without a single tremor. I am asking you, sir, with respect, do not touch that dial. The room was completely silent. Ryan Mitchell's voice was still coming through the speaker. Ghost, please, come back. I'm at 6,700. I don't know what just happened. Somebody talk to me. Price looked at Okafor. He looked at the speaker. He looked at the radar screen where the descending track of Hornet 3 was moving toward the ground with the quiet mathematical certainty of something that did not care about rank or procedure or the pride of any human being in the room. And then Colonel Marcus Reed, who had been standing 6 feet away and had watched everything happen in the span of 9 seconds, said one sentence in a voice that was absolutely flat and absolutely final. Harlan, stop. Price turned. Reed was not angry. That was the thing that Price would remember afterward. Reed was not performing authority, was not raising his voice, was not doing any of the things that senior officers did when they wanted to remind the room who was in charge. He simply looked at Price with the expression of a man who had made a decision and was not going to revisit it. Give her back the headset, Reed said, right now. Price held the headset in his right hand. 6 seconds passed. Everyone in the room counted them. Then Price set the headset on the console. He did not hand it back to Evelyn. He set it down and stepped away from the console and walked to the back wall and stood there. And his face was doing something complicated that none of the controllers wanted to look at directly. Evelyn picked up the headset. She settled it back over her ears. She pressed the transmit button. Her jaw was red where the cord had snapped against it, and she did not touch it, and she did not look at Price, and she did not say a single word about what had just happened. Hornet 3, this is Ghost. I'm here. Talk to me. The sound Ryan Mitchell made when her voice came back was not a professional sound. It was not a trained sound. It was the sound of a 26-year-old human being who had been suddenly and completely alone in the worst moment of his life, and had then just as suddenly not been alone anymore. It was a short, involuntary exhale that carried about 3 seconds worth of relief that he probably didn't realize he'd expressed over an open channel. Ghost, just the word, just her name. The call sign spoken like a hand grabbing a rope. I'm here, she said again. What is your altitude? 6,400. Airspeed, 198. She did the calculation instantly. The interruption had cost them 40 seconds of communication, and Ryan had lost 200 feet more than she would have wanted during that window. The margin that had been tight before was now tighter. She did not let any of that into her voice. You're doing fine, she said. You lost a little altitude, but your airspeed is good and your heading is exactly right. I need you to make a correction for me. Anything, tell me. Bring your nose up by 2 degrees, not 3. 2. You're going to feel like it's not enough. It is enough. 2 degrees and hold. 2 degrees nose up, copy. She watched the radar track. The descent rate slowed fractionally. Not dramatically, there was no dramatic correction available to them at this point, but fractionally measurably in the way that small, precise adjustments accumulated into outcomes. Good, she said. Hold it right there. Ryan, can you see the runway yet? Yes, I can see it. It's small. It always looks small from up here. It gets bigger, trust me on that. It looks really small, Ghost. Every runway in the world looks small from 5 miles out in a dead aircraft. That is a completely normal reaction and it means absolutely nothing. Keep your eyes on it and don't move your hands. Behind her, Okafor was feeding her updated wind numbers in a quiet, steady stream. Reed had moved closer to the console. Price remained at the back wall and said nothing. And outside the operations building on the flight line, on the tarmac, in the doorways of hangars and maintenance buildings across Falcon Ridge, air station people were looking up at the same patch of Nevada sky, waiting. At 6,000 feet and 19 miles out, Ryan Mitchell was flying a dead aircraft toward a runway that was about to either receive him or refuse him, and the difference between those two outcomes was currently contained in the voice of a woman whose name most of the base had never bothered to learn. The timer on Okafor's screen read 7 minutes 40 seconds to threshold. That was when the wind shifted. It did not shift dramatically. It did not announce itself. It moved 3 degrees to the north and increased by 4 knots, and it did it in the space of 30 seconds, which was the amount of time between Okafor's last reading and her next one. Ghost, Okafor said quietly. Wind has moved, northwest at 22, gusting 26. Evelyn felt it before Okafor finished the sentence. She felt it in the radar track, the tiny, almost imperceptible, sideways drift in Ryan's course that told her the aircraft was being pushed. Ryan hadn't noticed it yet. He was managing airspeed and altitude, and the sight of a runway that still looked too small from too far away, and the wind was doing what wind did, which was arrive without asking permission and change every calculation that had already been made. She had 40 seconds to adjust. Hornet 3, I need you to listen carefully. The wind has changed. You're going to feel a push from your right. Do not fight it. I'm going to give you a new heading. Copy. Turn left 2 degrees, not more. Turning left 2. A pause. Ghost, I can feel it. The aircraft is moving. I know. 2 degrees left and hold. You're correcting for the wind, not fighting it. There's a difference. 2 degrees left, holding. She watched the track correct. It was not perfect. The wind was still pushing and Ryan was having to hold a constant slight pressure on the rudder to maintain the corrected heading. And that pressure was introducing drag that the calculations hadn't accounted for. She revised her mental model of his arrival altitude. 750 feet at threshold instead of 800. Still workable. Barely. But barely was a word she had worked with before. Okafor, she said, without taking her eyes off the screen. Confirm crash and rescue is positioned. Crash and rescue is on standby at the runway threshold. Fire suppression. Standing by. She nodded once. Not because she expected Ryan to need those things. She positioned them because a pilot who knew rescue was waiting at the end of the runway, was a pilot who could commit to the landing without a corner of his mind managing a worst-case scenario. It freed up mental bandwidth. Every bit of bandwidth mattered. Ryan, she said, fire and rescue is on the runway, not because I think you're going to need them, because that's how we do every emergency landing. You understand? Understood, Ghost. Tell me your altitude. 4,800. Airspeed. 201. Good. He'd managed to hold the airspeed through the wind correction. That was not a simple thing to do. And she knew it, and she let herself acknowledge it privately before speaking. That airspeed correction you just held through the wind change, that was textbook, she said. I mean that. I'm terrified, Ghost. He said it plainly, not as a confession, but as information. The way pilots were trained to give information factually without editorializing. I know you are. Being terrified is correct. If you weren't terrified, I'd be worried about your judgment. A beat. You know what the difference is between a terrified pilot and a dead pilot? What? The terrified pilot keeps flying. Another short silence on the channel, the kind that told her the words had landed. Keep flying, he said. Keep flying, she confirmed. Reed was at her shoulder now. He didn't speak, he simply watched the radar screen with the focused attention of a man who understood that his role in this moment was to stay out of the way of the person who was actually solving the problem. It was a kind of wisdom that not every commander had, and Evelyn noticed it without commenting on it. 2 minutes to my decision point, she said to Reed quietly so the channel didn't carry it to Ryan. Reed looked at her. Decision point for what? There's a moment coming where his numbers are going to look unworkable. They're going to tell him he can't make the runway. He's going to feel it in the aircraft before I can tell him it's wrong. She kept her voice flat, factual. When that moment comes, he needs to hear my voice telling him to stay with it instead of making a different choice. What different choice? She looked at Reed directly. He could pull back and gain altitude for the ejection. Reed understood immediately. If he ejects at that altitude and position over the mountains, the survival odds are not good. She looked back at the screen. So I need him to stay with it. I need him to trust me past the point where his instincts are going to tell him not to. Reed was quiet for a moment. And if your numbers are wrong, she held his gaze. My numbers are not wrong. It was not arrogance. Reed recognized the difference. It was the statement of someone who had done this calculation with her own life on the line and who understood from the inside exactly what margin of error she was working with. Okay, he said. Ghost, Ryan's voice came through and something in it had shifted again, the first hint of a new kind of edge. Not panic, something more controlled and more dangerous than panic. The edge of a pilot who had just looked at his numbers and arrived at a conclusion. Ghost, I'm looking at my position and my altitude, and I don't think I have enough to make the runway. There it was, the moment she'd been waiting for. Ryan, listen to me. I'm 3,600 feet and I'm 13 miles out, and the math says I'm short, Ghost. The math says Orion. Her voice did not rise. It simply settled the way a hand settles on a shoulder. Firm and present and impossible to ignore. Stop doing the math and talk to me. I can't just stop doing the math. Yes, you can, because I'm doing the math. That's my job right now. Your job is to fly the aircraft. Do you copy? A 3-second pause. The longest 3 seconds of the entire transmission. Copy, he said. Good. Now I need you to do something that is going to feel completely wrong, and I need you to do it anyway. What? I need you to lower your nose by 1 degree. Dead silence on the channel. Then Ghost, if I lower my nose, I lose altitude faster. I know. That's the wrong direction. I know it feels that way. 1 degree nose down, Ryan. Now, in the control room. Okafor turned to look at Evelyn with an expression that she kept off her face with professional discipline, but which her eyes did not entirely conceal. Because what Evelyn was asking Ryan to do looked on the numbers exactly like what Ryan thought it was, a command to descend faster when he was already concerned about being short. But Evelyn was not looking at the same picture everyone else was looking at. She was looking at something that came from years of flying dead aircraft that had no right to be still flying. She was looking at the aerodynamics of a specific aircraft type, at a specific weight with a specific wind profile from a specific direction, and she was seeing something in the combination of those factors that the raw altitude and distance calculation didn't capture. She was seeing a glide ratio improvement, counterintuitive, completely counterintuitive. At a slightly lower nose angle, the aircraft's drag profile changed in a way that improved its forward distance per foot of altitude lost. Not dramatically, but enough. The difference between 1 mile short and on the runway. Ryan lowered his nose. The silence in the control room was the silence of everyone watching a person walk to the edge of something and not knowing whether the ground was there. Evelyn watched the radar track. She watched the descent rate. She watched the forward progress. She did not hold her breath because she had learned a long time ago that holding your breath was something you did when you weren't sure, and she was sure. She was sure the way she was sure of the calluses on her hands and the years behind her and the specific, unrepeatable knowledge of what an F-18 could do when its pilot had been convinced to stop fighting it. Ghost, Ryan's voice, quiet, awed almost. My forward progress just it increased. I know. How did you know that would? Tell me your altitude and give me a distance estimate to the runway. A pause while he calculated. 2,800 feet, distance to runway ghost. I think I'm going to make it. I think the numbers just changed. The numbers didn't change, she said. The picture changed. That's different. Another pause. What's the difference? Numbers tell you where you are. The picture tells you what's possible. She kept her eyes on the screen. You've got 18 minutes of flight training that's been keeping you alive since this started. Now I need you to fly the last 2 miles on something different. What's that conviction? She said simply. You are going to land this aircraft. The control room held its breath. Not collectively, not performatively, just individually. Each person in that room holding something inside their chest that they would struggle to name precisely afterward. The fire rescue crews at the end of the runway held it. The pilots standing in hangar doorways held it. Even Colonel Price at the back wall with his arms folded and his complicated expression had gone completely still. 2,000 feet, Ryan said. I can see the numbers on the runway. Don't look at the numbers yet. Look at the threshold. I see the threshold. Is it rising or falling relative to your canopy frame? A beat. Rising. That means you are going to be long, not short. You are over the runway right now, Ryan. You just don't know it yet. Over the runway, he repeated, and she could hear him trying on the idea, trying to believe it against the evidence of his instruments and his fear. Tell me your airspeed. 194. Let it bleed to 188. Slowly. Don't rush it. 188, Hovey. For his voice in her ear, quiet and professional. He's passing 1,000 feet. 1,000 feet. The ground was real now. The runway was real. Ryan Mitchell was either going to land or he wasn't, and every variable that mattered had already been set in motion, and the only thing left was the execution. This was always the part where Evelyn's hands used to be on the stick. Right now, her hands were at her sides. That was the hardest thing about this entire morning. The understanding that she had done everything she could do from the ground, and the rest of it was in the hands of a 26-year-old who was about to find out what kind of pilot he actually was. Ryan, she said, I need you to hear me clearly. I'm listening. In 30 seconds, I'm going to give you your final correction. After that, I go quiet. I go quiet because there's nothing left for me to say. Everything I know, everything I've given you, it's already in your hands. You understand. Stand a silence. What if I need you? You won't. She said it without hesitation. You haven't needed me for the last 3 minutes. You've been flying this on your own. I've just been keeping you company. She heard something through the headset that took her a moment to identify. He was laughing, not the hysterical release of someone cracking under pressure. A short, genuine, slightly disbelieving laugh. The laugh of someone who had just heard something that was both absurd and completely true at the same time. Keeping me company, he said. 500 feet, Okafor said. Evelyn pressed the transmit button one final time. Raise your nose, she said. Now gently. Let the main gear find the runway. Do not force it. Let the runway come up to you. She released the button. She stepped back from the console. And the control room filled with the sound that everyone in it had been waiting for since the moment Ryan Mitchell first called Mayday. The sound of rubber meeting concrete. The particular bark and scream of landing gear. Touching a surface at speed, the howl of a pilot applying every braking system available to him. The long deceleration noise that meant the aircraft was on the ground and staying there. It lasted 11 seconds. Then Ryan's voice came through the speaker, and it was not a professional voice, and it was not a trained voice, and it was not the voice of a United States Navy fighter pilot who had spent his career learning to be calm in the face of impossible things. It was just a young man's voice. I'm down, he said. I'm down, Ghost. I'm on the runway. I'm down. The control room erupted. Not in the way movie control rooms erupted. Not in the staged, orchestrated way of a scripted moment. It erupted the way real rooms erupted, when real pressure released all at once, people grabbing each other's shoulders, someone letting out a sound that was half shout and half sob, Okafor pressing both hands flat on her console and dropping her head between her arms and just breathing, someone in the back of the room actually applauding and then stopping because it felt wrong, and then starting again because nothing about this moment was going to follow normal rules. Reed put his hand on Evelyn's shoulder. She was still looking at the radar screen. The blip that was Hornet 3 was stationary on the runway. Stationary. She stood there and looked at that stationary blip for a long moment without speaking. And Reed left his hand on her shoulder and didn't say anything because he understood that what she was doing right now was not celebrating and was not processing and was not any of the things that the people around her were doing. She was just looking at the proof that the calculation had been right. The proof that 7 years had not taken from her what she had been afraid in her quietest moments that it might have taken. Then she reached up and removed the headset and set it on the console and turned around. The first person she saw was Price. I was still at the back wall. His arms were no longer folded. He was standing with his hands at his sides, and the complicated expression on his face had settled into something less complicated and harder to look at, the expression of a man who had made a very specific kind of error and was currently understanding the full dimensions of it. Their eyes met across the control room. Evelyn did not say anything. She held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then she looked away because she had something much more important to do than make Colonel Harlan Price feel worse than he already felt. She walked to the door. She opened it. She walked out into the corridor, into the cold air of the operations building, and she found a wall, and she put her back against it, and she closed her eyes. And for 30 seconds, just 30 seconds, she let herself feel all of the things she had not been able to feel while she was on that headset. The fear she had managed and hidden, the memory of her own final flight that had been running underneath every calculation. The weight of 7 years of silence and maintenance logs and being the woman nobody noticed, all of it. She stood against that wall in the corridor at Falcon Ridge Air Station, and she felt all of it at once, and it was enormous, and it was terrible, and it was also in a way she hadn't expected and couldn't quite explain. It was clean, like something that had been held under pressure had finally been allowed to simply be what it was. After 30 seconds, she opened her eyes. Down the corridor, she could hear the noise from the control room, the release, the celebration, people talking too loud and too fast the way people talked when something that was supposed to be a tragedy had resolved into survival. She straightened away from the wall. She rolled her shoulder once, the left one, the one that carried the oldest scar from the oldest injury. She walked back toward her office. She was halfway there when Reed came through the control room door and saw her. "Carter," he said. She stopped. He walked to her, and he was not the base commander in that moment, and they both knew it. He was simply a man who had just watched something significant happen and needed to acknowledge it to the person who had made it happen. That was... He stopped. Tried again. "I've been in this Air Force for 30 years. I've seen a lot of things in this Air Force." He shook his head. "That was something I haven't seen." Evelyn looked at him steadily. "He's a good pilot," she said. "He was always going to make it." Reed almost smiled. "You did believe that when you first looked at the radar screen?" "No," she admitted. "I didn't." "What changed?" She was quiet for a moment. "He trusted me. When I told him to lower the nose, when every instinct he had was screaming that I was wrong, he trusted me anyway." She paused. "That's not something you can teach. That has to be in a person already." Reed nodded slowly. He looked at her for a long moment. "You know this doesn't go away right after today. What you did in that room, that doesn't go back in a box." She looked at him with an expression that he couldn't immediately read, and then he understood that what he was seeing was not resignation and was not reluctance. It was something older and quieter than either of those things. "I know," she said. And from down the corridor, through the wall, through the closed door of the main operations building, came the sound of Ryan Mitchell's aircraft being surrounded by fire crews and ground personnel, and the particular organized chaos of an emergency arrival, the sound of a situation that had resolved into survival instead of catastrophe. The sound of someone still alive who should, by the arithmetic of this morning, not have been. Evelyn stood in the corridor and listened to it. She did not return to her office. Not yet. Because Reed was right and she knew he was right, and somewhere deep in the part of herself that she had spent 7 years covering with maintenance logs and silence, and the careful pretense of a smaller life, somewhere underneath all of that, she had known it the moment she picked up the headset. Some things once done could not be undone. Some doors once opened did not close again. She had spent 7 years walking away from the sky, and the sky this morning had simply refused to let her go. 3 minutes later, the door at the end of the corridor opened, and a young man walked in from the flight line. He was still in his flight suit. His helmet was under his arm. His face had the particular quality of someone who had very recently been through something that the human mind needed considerable time to process. Pale, under the tan eyes, slightly too wide hands that were not quite steady. He stopped when he saw her. He did not seem to know what to say. She did not help him find the words. She waited. Because this was his moment too, and he had earned it. "You're Miss Carter," Ryan Mitchell finally said. His voice was slightly rough. "You're the one from you work in the records office." "I do," she said. He looked at her. He looked at her the way people sometimes looked at things that didn't match the shape they expected, trying to reconcile what they saw with what they now knew. "You saved my life," he said. She met his eyes. "You saved your own life," she said. "I just stayed on the radio." He shook his head slowly. That's not what happened." "What do you think happened, Lieutenant?" He opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. "I think the most important person on this base has been sitting in a room by herself for 7 years, and nobody knew it." The corridor was quiet. Evelyn Carter looked at the young pilot in his flight suit with his slightly unsteady hands in his eyes that were still carrying the particular brightness of someone who had looked at the wrong side of a line and come back. She thought about a lot of things in that silence. She thought about a cockpit at 31,000 feet and the sound of her own engines dying and the voice that wasn't there when she needed it. She thought about the long drive to Falcon Ridge 7 years ago, with her injury and her silence and the decision she had made to let the world forget her name. She thought about maintenance logs and birthday remembrances and 6 years and 11 months of being invisible. She thought about the word conviction. Then she said, "Go see the flight surgeon, Lieutenant, and call your family." He nodded. He started to move past her. Then he stopped. "Ghost," he said. "Not Miss Carter. Ghost. Thank you." She looked at him for one more second. "Welcome back to the ground," she said. He walked out through the door at the end of the corridor, and she stood alone and listened to his footsteps fade, and the bass hummed around her, with the sound of a normal morning reassembling itself after something that was not normal at all. And in the small office at the edge of the operations building, on the desk by the window that looked out at the flight line, the window she had requested because she needed to feel the direction of the wind, a half-finished cup of black coffee had gone cold. She did not go back to it, not because she was done with the work of the office, not because she was planning to walk away from the files and the records and the careful administrative labor of keeping an Air Force running, but because something had shifted in the weight of this morning in a way that she was still measuring. And she had learned in the sky, in the long silence afterward, and now again today, that the moments that changed you didn't announce themselves. They simply arrived, and they were enormous, and afterward, the world looked exactly the same as before, and completely different at the same time. She stood at the window. She watched the flight line. She watched the fire crews moving around Ryan Mitchell's F-18. And for the first time in 6 years and 11 months, she let herself watch the planes. The official incident report landed on Colonel Harlan Price's desk at 1400 hours. He had been waiting for it. He had spent the 3 hours between Ryan Mitchell's landing and the report's arrival doing something that people who knew him would have described as entirely out of character. He had been sitting at his desk without doing anything. No phone calls, no paperwork, no subordinates summoned and dispatched. Just sitting with his hands folded on the desk surface looking at the wall. His aide, a sharp young captain named Torres, had knocked twice and been waved away both times. Price was not a man who spent time sitting with uncomfortable things. His entire career had been built on the premise that discomfort was a problem to be solved, a situation to be corrected, a deviation from procedure to be addressed and closed. He had risen through the ranks precisely because he was the officer who looked at a problem and immediately began moving toward a solution, and the moving was so instinctive and so constant that he had never developed much practice at simply remaining still in the presence of something that couldn't be fixed by action. What he had done in that control room could not be fixed by action. He had grabbed a headset out of a woman's hands while a pilot was falling out of the sky. He had tried to cut the radio frequency. He had been physically stopped by a sergeant half his age. And then he had stood at the back of the room and watched the woman he had tried to remove save a life with nothing but her voice and 20 years of knowledge that he had never thought to ask about. The incident report confirmed what he already knew. Both engine flameouts caused by a fuel system contamination during the pre-flight Fueling process, a maintenance error, not pilot error, which meant Ryan Mitchell had gone up in an aircraft that was already carrying a failure he had no way to detect. The report was thorough and precise, and it contained a section near the end under the heading of emergency response that described the role of civilian specialist Evelyn Carter in the successful recovery of Hornet 3. Price read that section 3 times. Then he picked up his phone and called Reed. Reed answered on the second ring. "Marcus, I need to talk to you," Price said. "Yes," Reed said. "You do." A pause. "My office, 15 minutes," and the call ended. Price set the phone down. He stood up, straightened his uniform, and walked out the door. Across the base in the flight surgeon's examination room, Ryan Mitchell was sitting on a medical table in a paper gown, while Dr. Amelia Vasquez, the base flight surgeon, worked through a standard post-emergency physical with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. Ryan's vitals were normal. His hands had stopped shaking approximately 40 minutes after landing. His cognitive responses were sharp and appropriate. He was fine, physically. "Your cortisol is through the roof," Dr. Vasquez said, not unkindly marking something on her tablet. "That's normal for what you went through. It'll normalize over the next 48 hours. I'm going to recommend 48 hours of stand down before you go back in a cockpit." "Understood," Ryan said. She looked at him over the tablet. "You want to talk about it?" "Not yet." "That's also normal." She made another note. "The chaplain is available if you want I'm okay." He said it reflexively and then reconsidered. "I mean, I will be okay. Right now I'm still kind of processing it." Vasquez nodded. She had a good face for this kind of conversation, attentive without being intrusive, present without pushing. "What are you processing specifically?" Ryan was quiet for a moment. "I keep thinking about when she went quiet," he said. "Ghost." When Price pulled the headset, those 40 seconds, when I couldn't hear her voice. I was at 6,700 feet with no engines, and suddenly the radio just had nothing. And I felt it physically. I felt it in my chest like something had been taken out. And then she came back. He looked at his hands. I've never had that experience before, of someone's voice being the thing keeping me not just calm, but present. Like without her voice, I was starting to drift somewhere I couldn't come back from. And then she was back, and I snapped back into my body. He paused. "Does that make sense?" "It makes complete sense," Vasquez said. "That's what a good controller does. That's what she did." "She's not a controller. She processes maintenance records." Vasquez looked at him steadily. "Today she was a controller." Ryan shook his head slowly. "No, today she was whatever she actually is, which is something I don't have a word for." He looked up. "I want to know her story. I want to know everything about how someone like that ends up in a records office." Vasquez set down her tablet. "Ask her," she said simply. In Reed's office, the conversation between the two colonels had been going for 11 minutes and had not gone the way that either of them expected. Price had walked in prepared for a confrontation. He had composed in the walk across the base a version of events that acknowledged the emotional temperature of the moment, while defending the procedural basis of his actions. A civilian specialist operating radio equipment in an active emergency without certification or authorization was a genuine regulatory issue regardless of the outcome. He had the argument ready. He never used it. Because Reed didn't come at him with anger. Reed sat across the desk and looked at him with the expression of a man who had moved past the point where anger was the most useful emotion available, and who was now operating in the territory of something more considered and more permanent. "Tell me what you were thinking," Reed said. "Not what you're going to put in a report, what you were actually thinking when you grabbed that headset." Price looked at him. He had not expected that question. He had expected accusation. He had expected procedure. He had expected the formal language of an incident that was going to move up the chain. He had not expected Reed to ask him what he was actually thinking. And because the question was genuine, and because Price was underneath the procedural certainty and the rigid hierarchy of his professional identity, also a genuine person, he answered it honestly. "I thought she was going to get him killed," he said. Silence. "I walked in and I saw a civilian, a woman I'd never seen operate any kind of emergency equipment on an open channel with a pilot in extremis. And my first thought was that whoever had put her there had made a catastrophic error. And I acted on that thought." He paused. "I didn't ask, I didn't verify, I just acted." Reed looked at him for a long time. You know what the core of that is, Reed said finally. I assumed, Price said. He said it like a man who understood the weight of what he was admitting. You looked at her and you saw what was on the surface, and you built a complete operational picture from it in about 3 seconds, and you acted on it without checking a single element. Reed leaned forward. Harlan, she has more emergency landing hours in her flight record than anyone currently serving on this base, including you, including me. Price was very still. I know, he said. You didn't know this morning. No, I didn't. Why didn't you know? Price looked at the desk. Because I never looked at her file. The sentence sat in the room between them. Reed did not pile on. He was not the kind of commander who needed to drive a lesson home with additional weight once it had already landed. He simply let the silence do what silence did. After a moment, Price looked up. What's she gonna do, Carter, after today? I don't know, Reed said. That's her decision, but I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to make sure that everyone on this base knows who she is. He paused. Everyone who should have known a long time ago. The meeting ended 17 minutes after it began. Price walked back across the base alone, and this time he did not look at the ground. He looked at the people he passed, the maintenance crews, the junior officers, the administrative staff moving between buildings. He looked at them the way he had not looked at them before, which was as people who might be carrying something he had never thought to ask about. It was an uncomfortable way to look at the world. He suspected it was going to stay uncomfortable for a long time. And he suspected, though he would not have admitted it to anyone yet, that uncomfortable was probably the correct way to feel. At 1500 hours, Evelyn Carter received a phone call. She was back at her desk. She had returned to it approximately 2 hours after the landing because the files still needed processing and the radar data still needed correction, and the work did not stop because something significant had happened. She had answered 3 separate colleagues who knocked on her office door, each one wanting to say something about the morning, each one slightly uncertain how to start the conversation, each one receiving a polite acknowledgement and a gentle redirection. She was not being cold. She was simply not ready yet to be the story. She was still the person who lived it. The phone call was from a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. She answered on the 4th ring. Captain Carter. The voice on the other end was male, older, with the particular cadence of someone who had spent decades making important phone calls and had never quite lost the formality of the first one. This is General Patricia Holman's office. I'm calling on behalf of the General. She'd like to speak with you at your earliest convenience about the events of this morning. Evelyn set down her pen. General Patricia Holman was the commanding general of Air Combat Command. She was in the organizational structure of the United States Air Force, approximately as far above Evelyn Carter's current administrative position as the stratosphere was above the Nevada desert floor. I see, Evelyn said carefully. May I ask how the general became aware of this morning's events? A brief pause. The general monitors all emergency incidents involving aircraft within her command captain. She received a preliminary briefing approximately 1 hour ago. Another pause. She asked specifically whether the civilian specialist involved had previously held a military commission. She did her research, Evelyn said. The general is thorough, the aide confirmed. Would tomorrow morning at 0800 work for a call? Evelyn looked out her window at the flight line. The sun was lower now. The F-18s were lined up in their usual positions except for the space where Hornet 3 would normally have been, and that absence was somehow more noticeable than the presence of the others. 0800 works, she said. Thank you. She hung up. She sat with the phone in her hand for a moment. Then she set it down, picked up her pen, and went back to the maintenance log she had been working on. Not because she was indifferent to the call, not because she was unaware of what it might mean, because the log had an error in it, and errors in maintenance records could cost lives, and that work had not changed in importance just because a general wanted to talk to her. Some things remained constant. That constancy was something she had always trusted more than attention. At 16:30, Ryan Mitchell knocked on her office door. I was out of his flight suit now in the standard utility uniform that made him look younger, somehow less like a fighter pilot, and more like a very earnest young man who had spent the morning in the most frightening experience of his life and was now trying to figure out what to do with the afternoon. Can I come in? He said. Evelyn looked up from her desk. She gestured to the chair across from her. He sat down, and for a moment, he didn't say anything. He looked around the office, the filing cabinets, the stacked folders, the single window with its view of the flight line, and she could see him trying to reconcile the space with what he now knew about the person who occupied it. Small office, he said finally. It's sufficient. He nodded. He looked at his hands briefly, then back at her. I called my mother, he said. After the flight surgeon, I called my mom. Evelyn waited. She cried, he said. I didn't expect that. I mean, I expected it, but I couldn't hear her crying without. He stopped. Sorry, that's not what I came here to say. What did you come here to say? He looked at her directly. I want to know who you are. She held his gaze. You know who I am. I'm the woman from the records office. No. He said it gently but firmly. I know what your job title says. I want to know who you are. I want to know how someone like you ends up in a place like this. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She looked at the window. Then she looked back at Ryan and she made a decision, not a dramatic decision, not a decision that felt large in the moment, but one of those small decisions that turned out later to be the ones that mattered most. She told him. Not all of it, not the version with all the details and the classified elements that were still technically not hers to share freely, but the shape of it, the arc of it. She told him about the call sign. She told him about the years of flying, about the instincts developed over thousands of hours in the air, about becoming the pilot. Other pilots called when they needed someone who could think past the edge of the standard procedures. She told him about the test flight and the catastrophic failure and the choice she had made to control the aircraft away from a populated area before ejecting to spend the last seconds of her flying career making sure the ground below her stayed safe. She told him about the injuries, about the rehabilitation, about the moment a doctor had told her with genuine compassion and no ambiguity at all that her days in a fighter cockpit were permanently over. She did not make it dramatic. She told it the way she processed everything factually at a steady pace with the same calibrated tone she had used on the radio that morning. But Ryan listened to it the way the radio channel had been quiet during the most critical moments of his approach, with complete, respectful, absolute attention. When she finished, the office was quiet for a long time. Why did you stay? He asked. After the flying, why stay in the Air Force world? Why not go somewhere else entirely? She thought about this. She had thought about it many times over the years, always arriving at the same answer from slightly different directions. Because the work here matters, she said. A maintenance log error doesn't make the news. Nobody writes stories about radar data corrections. But those things keep people alive, and I knew how to do them well, and I needed somewhere to put she paused, choosing the word carefully, my usefulness. But nobody knew, Ryan said. Nobody here knew what you'd done before. You never told anyone. I told the people who needed to know during my hiring process, she said. My background is in my file. He stared at her. Did anyone ever read your file? She looked at him steadily. What do you think? The silence that followed that question was one of those silences that answered itself. Ryan put his elbows on his knees and pressed his hands against his face briefly, a gesture that was not despair, but something adjacent to it, the gesture of someone realizing the dimensions of a thing they had been part of without knowing it. Price didn't read your file, he said. No. None of the commanders here. Colonel Reed knew a version of it, she said. He'd heard a reference somewhere years ago. He remembered it when it mattered. She paused. That was enough. That's not enough, Ryan said. That's ghost. That should never have been enough. Someone with your background, your experience, you should have been. What? She said, not sharply, genuinely curious. What should I have been? He opened his mouth, closed it. She watched him work through the answer, and she waited because this was actually important. The answer to this question mattered in a way that went beyond Ryan Mitchell's sense of justice or her own history. Teaching, he said finally. You should have been teaching, not just this morning, years ago. You should have been in the classrooms, in the simulators, in the ready rooms. Everything you know, that's not something that can be written in a manual. That has to come from a person. Evelyn looked at him. She looked at him for a long time. And then she said something that surprised him, which was, tell me about the moment you decided to lower your nose. He blinked. What? When I gave you that instruction, lower your nose by 1 degree, you hesitated. I heard it. 3 seconds on the channel. Then you did it. What happened in those 3 seconds? Ryan thought about it. He thought about it seriously, which was what she needed him to do. I ran the numbers in my head, he said slowly, And the numbers were wrong. The number said lowering my nose would make things worse. But, he stopped. But, she prompted. But I knew you'd thought through the numbers too, and you'd thought through them more, and you'd done it in a situation I couldn't understand from inside the cockpit. He looked at her. So I made a choice. I chose to trust your calculation over my own. That's right, she said. And do you know what that is? That specific decision in that specific moment? He shook his head slowly. That's the thing we can't put in a manual, she said. The willingness to trust a better set of eyes even when your own eyes are telling you something different. That is the difference between a good pilot and a great one. And I couldn't teach you that in a classroom. She paused. You could only learn it where you learned it. He understood what she meant. In the worst moment of my life, he said quietly. Yes. They sat with that for a moment. Then Ryan said, I'm going to ask you something and I want you to answer me honestly. All right. Did you know it was going to work? When you told me to lower the nose, did you know, or were you making your best calculation with incomplete data? Evelyn looked at him. Best calculation with incomplete data, she said. Same as every decision I made this morning. Same as every decision I ever made in a cockpit. She held his gaze. That's all any of us ever do, Ryan. The difference is in the quality of the data you've gathered before the moment arrives. He absorbed that. I want to fly for 30 more years, he said. And I want to be the kind of pilot that someone calls when it goes wrong. I want to be the kind of pilot that someone trusts. He looked at her. How do I become that? Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then she said, come back tomorrow. Bring your questions. He looked at her and she saw in his face past the relief and the processing and the slight tremor of someone still metabolizing a genuine brush with death. Something that she recognized because she had seen it in her own face a long time ago, in a mirror in a different life. The look of someone who understood that the real education had just begun. He stood up. He offered his hand. She shook it. He walked out. She turned back to her desk and she picked up her pen and she looked at the maintenance log for approximately 4 seconds before she set the pen back down. Because the thing Ryan had said, not the gratitude, not the questions, but the specific observation he had made, was sitting in her chest in a way that wouldn't settle. You should have been teaching, not just this morning, years ago. She had told herself for nearly 7 years that the work she was doing mattered. And it did. She believed that completely and without reservation. The logs and the records and the corrections, they were real work with real consequences, and she had done them with the same precision and care that she had once brought to flying. But there was a but. The but was Ryan Mitchell's face when he said that thing about trust. The but was the 40 seconds when Price had pulled the headset and Ryan's voice on the channel had broken apart into something raw and undefended. The but was the specific, irreplaceable quality of what had happened in that control room. Not the calculation, not the procedure, but the transmission of something that couldn't be written down or filed away. Her voice, her experience. The particular kind of knowledge that only existed inside people who had been in the place where the knowledge lived. She sat at her desk and she thought about it. And outside the window, the flight line was going quiet as the day shift ended, and the Nevada sky was doing what it did in November evenings, turning colors that she had once watched from 20,000 feet and now watched from a chair behind a desk. She picked up the phone. She called Reed's direct line. He answered immediately. Carter, I need to ask you something, she said. Ask. Is there a current opening in the Advanced Emergency Procedures curriculum, the simulator program? A pause. Not a long one, 3 seconds, maybe 4, but she heard something in it. The quality of a man who had been hoping for a specific phone call and was now receiving it and was trying not to respond in a way that pressured her. There's been an opening for 8 months, Reed said carefully. The position has been difficult to fill because of the specific experience requirements. What are the requirements? Real-world emergency landings, multiple aircraft types, demonstrated performance under operational conditions. Another pause. You'd be overqualified. I'm aware, she said, a longer pause. Evelyn, are you asking me to put your name forward? She looked out the window at the flight line, at the empty space where Hornet 3 would have been. Yes, she said. The words sat there for a moment, and it was small, just one syllable, but it weighed what 7 years weighed all the silence, in the distance, in the maintenance logs, in the careful smallness of a life built to keep a particular kind of pain at arm's length. One syllable that let all of it go. Done, Reed said. His voice was steady, but she heard something underneath it. Something that a man who had spent 30 years learning to keep his voice steady might allow himself in a phone call that nobody else would hear. It's done. She hung up. She sat a moment. Then she opened the maintenance log, found the error she had been tracking, corrected it with 3 precise strokes of the pen, and closed the file. The work was the work. That would not change. But tomorrow morning at 0800, she had a call with a general. And tomorrow afternoon, if she timed it right, she could look at the simulator schedule. And when Ryan Mitchell showed up with his questions, and he would show up, she was certain of that in the way she was certain of most things. She had thought through carefully she would have an answer that was better than come back tomorrow. The door of her office opened. She looked up. It was Okafor. The sergeant was still in her duty uniform. She had clearly come directly from the control room because she still had her security badge clipped to her pocket, and her hair was slightly less neat than it had been at the start of the shift. She stood in the doorway and looked at Evelyn with an expression that was doing several things at once, respect and apology, and something more personal that sat underneath both of them. I wanted to say something, Okafor said. Come in, Evelyn said. Okafor came in. She did not sit. She stood near the door with her hands clasped in front of her, and she said what she had come to say in the direct, economical way that Evelyn had already learned to associate with her. I've worked here for 3 years, Okafor said. In that time, I have walked past your office approximately 600 times. I have said good morning to you probably 200 of those times. I helped you carry boxes when you reorganized the filing system in March. She paused. I never once asked you who you were. I never once thought to ask. And I want to say that I am sorry for that because you deserve better from the people around you. And I was one of the people around you who didn't do better. Evelyn looked at her. She thought of a number of responses, the gracious deflection, the acknowledgement without acceptance, the reframing that would make Okafor feel less uncomfortable. She thought of all of them and set them aside. I appreciate that, she said, genuinely. Okafor nodded. She started to turn toward the door, then stopped. Can I ask you one thing? Yes. When Price grabbed the headset when you were out of communication for those 40 seconds, what were you thinking? Evelyn was quiet for a moment. I was thinking about Ryan, she said, about what he was hearing on his end, about the fact that he was at 6,700 feet with no engines, and suddenly the radio gave him nothing. Were you angry? Okafor asked. Not yet, Evelyn said. Anger was for afterward. In the moment, I was thinking about how to get back on the channel as fast as possible. Okafor nodded slowly. You know what I was thinking when I stepped in front of Price? What? I was thinking that if I didn't do something, a pilot was going to die, and I was going to spend the rest of my career knowing I stood there and let it happen. She paused. I wasn't being brave. I couldn't stand the alternative. Evelyn looked at her steadily. That's what brave is, she said, the inability to tolerate the alternative. Okafor absorbed that. She held Evelyn's gaze for a moment, and something passed between them, the particular acknowledgement that happened between people who had both been in a room where something real had occurred and who both understood the specific weight of it. Good night, Miss Carter, Okafor said. Good night, Sergeant, Evelyn said. Okafor left. The office was quiet. Evelyn sat at her desk in the last of the November light, and she looked at the window and she thought about a thing that Ryan had said, that she had not addressed directly the question of why she had stayed, why she had chosen this specific proximity to flying rather than removing herself from it entirely. The real answer, the one she had not given him because some answers needed to be lived before they could be spoken, was that she had never entirely believed she was done. Not consciously, not in any way she could have articulated, but some part of her had known. Some part of her had sat behind this desk for nearly 7 years and processed maintenance logs and corrected radar data and felt the direction of the wind through a window she had requested for reasons she told herself were old habit, and that part had known that the sky was not finished with her. It had waited, and today when it called her name, she had answered, not through a cockpit, not through the stick and the throttle and the 10,000 hours of physical memory in her hands, through a headset, through her voice, through the thing that could not be taken by injury or time or the long silence of a desk at the edge of the world. The knowledge, the irreplaceable accumulated hard-won knowledge of what it felt like to be alone in a failing aircraft and need someone to tell you that the runway was going to come to you. She reached out and turned off her desk lamp. She sat in the dark for a moment, Then she stood up, picked up her jacket, and walked out of the office. She did not look back at the desk. She walked out of the operations building into the cold November air, and she stood on the tarmac for a moment and she looked up. The Nevada sky in November was extraordinary, vast and dark, and populated with more stars than most people remembered the sky contained. She had looked at it from 20,000 feet. She had looked at it from a hospital bed. She had looked at it every day for 7 years from the window of a small office and told herself she was not looking. Tonight she looked at it from the ground and she did not pretend anything. It was the same sky. It had always been the same sky. And somewhere above her, threading between those stars on the standard approach path, an aircraft was descending toward the runway, the navigation lights blinking in their steady rhythm, the pilot inside making the 1,000 small adjustments that kept a machine in the air guided by instruments and training, and the particular combination of knowledge and conviction that made the difference between someone who flew and someone who flew well. Evelyn Carter stood on the tarmac and watched the lights descend. She watched until the aircraft touched down. Then she put on her jacket and walked to her car. Tomorrow was going to be a different kind of day. The call with General Patricia Holman lasted 47 minutes. Evelyn had expected 20. She had prepared for 20. Prepared her voice, her composure, the precise and economical way she intended to answer questions from a 3-star general who had presumably been briefed thoroughly and needed only confirmation of specific details. The call lasted 47 minutes because General Holman was not calling for confirmation. She was calling because she was angry. Not at Evelyn. Evelyn understood that within the first 90 seconds when Holman's voice crisp measured carrying the particular authority of someone who had spent decades making rooms fall silent, simply by entering them, said the following: without preamble, without pleasantry, without any of the formalities that junior officers use to buffer difficult conversations. Captain Carter, I have spent the last 16 hours reading your service record. I want you to tell me in your own words how a pilot with your qualifications ends up processing maintenance logs at a base that didn't know she existed. Evelyn sat very still at her desk. With respect, General, she said carefully, that's a complicated question. I have 47 minutes before my next briefing, Holman said. Uncomplicated. So Evelyn did. She told it the same way she had told Ryan. The arc of it, the shape of it, the test flight, in the injuries, in the decision to accept the administrative position, in the 7 years of silence. She told it without self-pity and without editorializing. And Holman listened the way senior officers listened when they were genuinely processing information rather than waiting for a pause to speak into. When Evelyn finished, there was a silence of approximately 4 seconds. Then Holman said, "The system failed you." Evelyn opened her mouth to offer the gracious deflection she had prepared. Holman continued before she could use it. I am not interested in your diplomatic response to that statement, Captain. I am telling you a fact. The system that was supposed to track and utilize talent at every level of the force failed to track and utilize you, and a pilot nearly died yesterday as a direct result of that failure. The only reason that pilot is alive is because you were close enough to a radio when the emergency happened. A pause. That is not a system that is functioning correctly. No, General, Evelyn said. It's not. What would you have done differently if you were designing this system? It was not the question Evelyn had expected. She had expected logistics, the simulator position, the certification questions, the administrative pathway back to a role with actual operational significance. She had not expected to be asked for her structural opinion by the commanding general of Air Combat Command 8 minutes into a phone call. She answered honestly. I would require every base commander to personally review the full service records of every civilian specialist with prior military flight experience, she said. Not the administrative summary, the full record, combat hours, emergency incidents, commendations, the actual narrative of who these people are and what they've done. She paused. There are people at bases across this command who are carrying knowledge that the force is not using. Not because they're hiding it, because nobody asked. Holman was quiet for a moment. How many, she said. I don't know, but more than 0. Another silence. I'm going to ask my staff to pull that data, Holman said. I want numbers. I want names. I want to know how many people are sitting behind desks at Air Force installations right now whose service records look anything like yours. Evelyn felt something shift in the conversation, A movement from the personal to the systemic that she hadn't anticipated. And that was, she realized, significantly larger than anything she had considered when she picked up the phone the previous evening. "General, I want to be clear," she said. "I'm not asking for—" "I know what you're not asking for," Holman said. "You're not asking for anything. That's part of the problem." A pause that carried something that might have been dry humor underneath its seriousness. Carter people who deserve recognition rarely ask for it. That's why the system has to look for them instead of waiting for them to raise their hands. The call continued. By the end of it, three things had been set in motion that Evelyn had not walked into the call expecting. First, her name was being formally put forward for the Advanced Emergency Procedures Instructor position, not as a request from Reed's level, but as a directive from Holman's office, which was a different thing entirely in the bureaucratic architecture of the United States Air Force. Second, Holman's staff was going to begin a review of personnel records across Air Combat Command, specifically looking for veterans with operational flight experience currently serving in non-operational civilian roles. Third, and this was the one that sat most unexpectedly in Evelyn's chest when the call ended, Holman had asked her in the last 5 minutes of the conversation if she would be willing to come to Langley in January to speak to a group of base commanders about the experience of transitioning from operational to administrative roles. "Not as a complaint," Holman had said, "as a case study. I want them to understand what they might have in their own buildings." Evelyn had said yes before she fully processed what she was agreeing to. After the call ended, she sat at her desk and looked at the phone for a long moment. Then she picked up her pen and went back to work because the morning's files were not going to process themselves, and because the steadiness of ordinary work was something she had come to trust in a way that she did not yet entirely trust the new and shifting ground of what was beginning to happen around her. At 1000 hours, she had a visitor she was not expecting. The knock on her door was tentative, not Ryan's knock, which had been direct, and not Reed's, which was brisk. This knock had the particular quality of someone who had been standing outside the door for longer than the knock itself suggested. "Come in," she said. The door opened. Colonel Harlan Price stood in the doorway. He was in his service uniform, which meant he had come from or was going to something formal. He looked like a man who had rehearsed what he was going to say and was now uncertain whether the rehearsal had prepared him adequately. He looked, in short, like a man who was uncomfortable and who had decided to be uncomfortable anyway, which was not a small thing. "Captain Carter," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Colonel Price." He came in. He did not sit. She had not invited him to sit, and he did not take that liberty. He stood near the door with his cover under his arm, and he said what he had come to say. "I owe you an apology," he said, "for what I did in the control room. Grabbing the headset, the physical nature of it." He stopped, started again. "That was wrong, procedurally wrong, and personally wrong, and the outcome of the situation makes it look worse than it might have if—" He caught himself. "No, actually it was wrong regardless of the outcome. I would like you to know that I understand that." Evelyn looked at him. She thought for a moment about what she wanted to say, about the cord snapping against her jaw, about the 40 seconds of silence on Ryan's channel, about the specific quality of being removed from a position of authority by someone who had not considered even for a single second the possibility that she might know what she was doing. She thought about all of it, and then she said, "Sit down, Colonel." He sat. "I accept your apology," she said. "Not because what happened didn't matter, because it did, but because I understand why you made the decision you made, and because understanding isn't the same as excusing, but it's also not the same as holding a grudge." Price looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately name. "You understand why I made the decision," he said. "You saw a civilian at a military console in an active emergency, and you acted on the most obvious interpretation of what you were seeing." She looked at him directly. "The error wasn't the action, Colonel. The error was everything that came before the action. You had been on this base for 8 months and you had never looked at my file." He absorbed that. "No," he said, "I hadn't." "Why?" The question was simple and genuine, and it clearly landed harder than he expected because he took a moment before answering. "Because your position didn't flag you as someone whose file I needed to review," he said. "You were civilian support staff. My attention was on operational personnel. And civilian support staff are not invisible," he said immediately. Then more slowly, "I told myself they weren't invisible. but I treated them as though their history didn't matter until it was relevant to an operational need. He paused, which is functionally the same as invisible. Evelyn nodded. I'm going to ask you something, she said. Please. When you walked into that control room and saw me on the headset before you made any decision about what to do, what was your first instinct, your very first? I thought about it seriously. Surprise, he said. That was the first thing. Genuine surprise because it was so outside what I expected to see. He paused. And then the surprise turned into alarm because the situation was critical and there was a deviation from expected procedure happening, and my entire career has been built on understanding that deviations from expected procedure in critical situations are dangerous. That's correct, she said. They usually are, but not this time. Not this time, because the expected procedure in this situation wasn't adequate to the specific expertise required. She leaned forward slightly. Colonel, you were not wrong to feel alarm at a deviation from procedure. You were wrong to act on that alarm without taking 3 seconds to find out why the deviation was happening. He looked at her. 3 seconds, he said. 3 seconds. You could have asked Reed. You could have asked Okafor. You could have looked at anyone in that room and asked, what's happening here? And someone would have told you, and you would have had the information you needed to make a different decision. He was quiet for a long moment. I didn't take 3 seconds. No, you didn't. She sat back. That's the lesson. Not that your instincts were wrong, that your instincts needed 3 seconds of information before they became action. Price looked at her with the expression of a man who was learning something and who was aware that he was learning it and who was sitting with the slight discomfort of that awareness without trying to move away from it. You're very calm about this, he said. I've had practice being calm under difficult circumstances, she said. He almost smiled. It didn't quite make it all the way to his face, but it got close. I suppose you have. He looked at his cover, then back at her. I heard about the general's call. Word travels. At this base, yes, he paused. I also heard about the simulator position. I want you to know that I will not present any administrative obstacles to that transition. I appreciate that. And he stopped, appeared to decide something. And I would like to sit in on the first session, if that's acceptable to you. Not to evaluate, not in any official capacity. I want to understand what I've been missing. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. It was not the request she had expected. Not from this man in this office on this particular morning. All right, she said. He stood. He put his cover back under his arm. He looked at her one more time with the expression she still couldn't entirely name, but was beginning to understand the expression of a man who had been forced to see something clearly and was now trying to figure out what to do with the clarity. Captain Carter, he said, for what it's worth, what you did yesterday was extraordinary. What I did yesterday, she said, was what anyone in that room would have done if they'd had the same information. He shook his head. No, it wasn't. He moved to the door. Good morning. He left. She sat at her desk and looked at the closed door for approximately 10 seconds. Then she picked up her pen. The files were not going to process themselves. At 11:45, 3 things happened in rapid succession that would have been notable individually and were together the kind of convergence that people who believed in such things might have called meaningful. First, Okafor knocked on her door and handed her a printed routing slip for the Advanced Emergency Procedures Instructor application. Formal paperwork moving through official channels with Reed's signature already on it and a note from the personnel office that the application was being expedited at the direction of Air Combat Command. Second, Ryan Mitchell appeared in her doorway approximately 30 seconds after Okafor left, carrying 2 cups of coffee and looking like a man who had spent a significant portion of the previous night thinking rather than sleeping. Third, before Ryan could say anything, Evelyn's desk phone rang. She held up one finger to Ryan, who stopped in the doorway. She answered the phone. Carter. Captain Carter, this is Master Sergeant Williams from Public Affairs. The voice was professional and slightly apologetic in the way public affairs voices often were when they were about to make a request that might not be welcome. Ma'am, we've been receiving inquiries from outside the base regarding the emergency incident yesterday. Several news organizations have. I want to be upfront with you. They've obtained some preliminary information about the civilian specialist involved in the recovery, and they are requesting interviews. I wanted to give you advance notice before. No interviews, Evelyn said. A pause. Ma'am, the inquiries are fairly, I want to be honest with you, they're persistent, and there is some pressure from Sergeant Williams, Evelyn said. Her voice was not unkind, but it was unambiguous. I am a civilian specialist in flight records. My work yesterday was a part of my job. I am not available for interviews, and I would appreciate if that position were communicated clearly to anyone who asks. Another pause. Understood, ma'am. I'll pass that along. He hesitated. For what it's worth, speaking as someone who heard what happened, I think what you did was remarkable. Thank you, Sergeant, she said. That's kind of you. She hung up. She looked at Ryan, who had clearly heard both sides of the conversation and was now standing in the doorway with one of the coffee cups extended and the expression of someone who had just remembered that the world outside Falcon Ridge Air Station also existed. They're coming, he said. They're already here, she said. She accepted the coffee. Sit down. He sat in a sector across from her desk, the same chair he'd occupied the previous afternoon, and he looked at her with the same directness he'd brought to that first conversation, and she understood that whatever he'd spent the night thinking about had not reduced the directness, but had given it a new quality. More settled, more certain of what it wanted to ask. I found your commendation citations, he said, from your service record. I asked Okafor to pull the public portions. Evelyn looked at him over her coffee cup. Did you? You saved 3 different aircraft in emergency situations before the test flight, he said. 3 different incidents, different aircraft types, different failures, different conditions. And in every single one of them, the finding was the same: recovery should not have been possible given the nature of the failure. He paused. How do you do that? How do you recover from something that isn't recoverable? You don't recover from it, she said. You change the definition of what recovery means. He stared at her. What does that mean? She thought about how to say it. She had thought about versions of this answer in the years since the last emergency landing, the one she hadn't walked away from flying, and she had arrived at different formulations of it at different times, but the core of it had always been the same. When an aircraft is in a failure state, she said, the instinct is to try to restore the previous condition, to get the engines back, to get the systems back, to return the situation to what it was before the failure. And sometimes you can do that, but sometimes the previous condition is gone, and the only thing trying to restore it does is waste the time and altitude and energy you need to work with what you actually have. She looked at him. Recovery isn't always going back. Sometimes it's going somewhere different. He sat with that. That's not just about flying, he said. No, she agreed. It's not. He looked at his coffee cup. Is that what you did after the last flight? You stopped trying to go back and started going somewhere different. She looked at him with the particular quality of attention she gave to questions that deserved it. I tried to go back for a long time, she said honestly. The first year, most of the second, I kept looking for a way to restore the previous condition. She paused. At some point, I stopped. I can't tell you exactly when. I woke up one morning and I was done looking backward. And you came here. And I came here. He nodded slowly. And now, she set down her coffee cup. Now the trajectory is different, she said simply. He looked at her for a moment, and then he said something that surprised her in the same way a turbulent shift surprised a pilot, not alarming, but requiring rapid recalibration. I called Lieutenant Colonel Vasquez, he said, the one who told the story about Ghost in the pilot lounge 2 years ago. Evelyn went still. He cried, Ryan said quietly. When I told him what happened, he literally cried. He said he asked me to tell you something. She waited. He said he thought about you for years. He said he never stopped thinking about the fact that you ended up behind a desk somewhere, and he never did anything about it. He said he knew people, he could have found you, he could have made noise about getting your skills into a training program or a simulator curriculum. He said he let it go because life moved forward and he was busy and he never... Ryan stopped. He cleared his throat. He said to tell you that he's sorry, that he should have made more noise. The office was very quiet. Evelyn looked at the window for a moment. Vasquez. She remembered the quality of his flying, the particular way he laughed, the fact that he had been one of the first people to call her Ghost, not as a call sign, but as a name with the kind of easy familiarity that said he recognized who she was. She had not thought about him in years. That was not entirely true. She had thought about him the way she thought about everything from before, briefly at the edges of things, and then not at all, because the habit of not thinking about it had become its own kind of insulation. Tell him, she said carefully, that he doesn't need to be sorry. That things happen when they're supposed to happen. She paused. And tell him I said hello. Ryan nodded. He reached into the chest pocket of his uniform and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He set it on her desk. She looked at it. What is this? He asked me to give you his contact information, Ryan said. In case you wanted to, he left the sentence open. She looked at the folded paper for a moment. Then she picked it up and put it in her desk drawer. Thank you, she said. He stood to leave, then stopped because it had become his habit in these visits to her office to stop at the door with one more thing. Ghost, he said. She looked at him. When you're running the simulator sessions, the emergency procedures curriculum, will you do something for me? What? Tell them about the nose thing, he said. Tell them about the moment when the numbers say one thing and the experience says another thing and you have to choose. Tell them exactly what you told me, that it felt wrong, that the instinct was to go the other way, but that you knew. He held her gaze. Because I think that's the thing that saves people, not the procedure. The knowledge that someone has done the impossible thing before and written down the directions. She looked at him for a long moment. Okay, she said. He left. She sat at her desk. She sat there for 3 minutes without moving. Which was unusual for her. She was not a person who sat without moving for 3 minutes very often. But she was processing something that needed the full 3 minutes, which was the compound experience of the morning. The general's call. Price's apology. Williams and the press inquiries Vasquez crying on a phone call to a 26-year-old pilot who had thought to make the call. 7 years. 7 years of being the woman nobody noticed, and in 24 hours the world had tilted in a way that could not be tilted back. She was not entirely sure how she felt about that. She understood intellectually that it was good, that the simulator position and the general's interest in the systemic review of personnel records were good things not just for her, but for the people who might be reached by the work that came from them. She understood that Ryan was right about the knowledge needing to live in people rather than manuals. And she understood that she was one of those people and that being one of those people carried an obligation. She understood all of it. But there was a part of her, the part that had built the quiet life that had made the deliberate choice to exist at the edges of the world. She used to occupy that felt the speed of the change and was not entirely ready for it. The phone rang again. She answered it. Carter. Evelyn. It was Reed. He used her first name only when they were outside the formal structure of the base, which meant either the day had shifted in some way she hadn't caught up with yet, or he needed her to hear what he was about to say as a person rather than as a commander. Marcus, she said, I need to tell you something before you hear it from someone else. A pause. The story is out. Out, not officially, not from public affairs, but someone talked. I don't know who. The initial information is sketchy. They don't have your name yet. They have a female civilian specialist with prior military flight experience. But the story is moving, and it is going to get more specific before it gets less. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. How fast, she said. Fast. By end of day today, I think, possibly sooner. He paused. I can try to slow it, but I can't stop it. The incident is a matter of record, and the people who were in that control room are not obligated to silence. I know, she said. She thought about it. Don't slow it. A surprise pause. Evelyn. If it comes out, it comes out, she said. I'm not going to hide from it. That's not the direction I'm moving anymore. She thought of the drawer with Vasquez's phone number in it. She thought of Ryan's face in the doorway saying, tell them about the nose thing. She thought of Holman's voice saying people who deserve recognition rarely ask for it. All right, Reed said. He paused again, and the pause had something in it that she recognized as the particular quality of a man who had something more to say and was deciding whether to say it. Say it, she said, a short sound that might have been a laugh. The story that's moving out there, the version they have right now, it's already getting traction. It's the kind of story that people respond to. He paused carefully. A lot of people are going to want to know who Ghost is. I know, she said. How do you feel about that? She thought about it honestly, sat with the question the way Holman had sat with her answers, not performing consideration, but actually considering. I feel like it's been 7 years, she said finally, and I feel like I'm tired of being someone nobody knows. Reed was quiet for a moment. Okay, he said softly. Okay, Evelyn. She hung up. She turned to her desk and she looked at the routing slip that Okafor had brought, the formal paperwork for the instructor position, moving through channels carrying Reed's signature and the weight of a general's interest. She looked at the folded piece of paper in her open desk drawer with Vasquez's phone number on it. She looked at the maintenance log she had been working on before Price's visit, still open to the page with the corrected error. She picked up the maintenance log. She finished the correction. She closed the file, and then she opened her desk drawer and took out the piece of paper with Vasquez's phone number. And she looked at it for a moment, and she set it on the desk in front of her where she could see it. She was not ready to make the call yet, but she was going to make it. That much she knew. The afternoon shifted toward 1400 hours, and the base moved around her in its ordinary rhythms: aircraft launching and recovering, maintenance crews moving between aircraft, the constant background hum of an operational installation going about its work. She processed 3 more files. She corrected 2 additional data errors. She answered 2 emails and forwarded a third to the appropriate department. She did her work. And at 14:37, the door of her office opened without a knock, and she looked up, expecting Ryan or Reed, or possibly Okafor with another form. She did not expect the person standing in the door. It was a woman she had never seen before, late 30s in civilian clothes with a press badge clipped to her jacket, and the particular combination of confidence and careful deference that experienced journalists develop for situations where they were somewhere they might not be entirely welcome. "Captain Carter," the woman said. Not a question. Evelyn looked at her. "I'm sorry to come directly to your office," the woman said. "I was told you declined an interview request through public affairs. I want to respect that. I'm not here to push." A pause. "I'm here because I've been covering military aviation for 11 years, and I heard about what happened yesterday, and I drove 6 hours from Phoenix this morning because I believe the story matters. Not the emergency, the other part." Evelyn looked at her steadily. "What other part?" The journalist looked back at her with the directness of someone who had earned the confidence to be direct. "The part about what happens to people like you," she said. "The people the system loses track of. The people sitting in records offices who could be in classrooms." She paused. "That's not just your story, Captain Carter. That's a lot of people's story, and I think it should be told." The office was quiet. Evelyn looked at this woman she had never met, who had driven 6 hours on a story she believed in, who was standing in a doorway with a press badge and the particular kind of certainty that came from knowing why you were somewhere. She thought about Holman. She thought about the review of personnel records across Air Combat Command. She thought about Ryan saying, "Tell them about the nose thing." She thought about what it meant to change the definition of recovery. She looked at the journalist for a long moment. Then she said, "Close the door." The woman stepped inside and closed the door behind her. She sat down in the chair across from Evelyn's desk, the same chair that Ryan had sat in, that Price had sat in, that had received more significant visitors in the past 24 hours than it had in the previous 7 years. And she took out a small recorder and set it on the desk between them. She looked at Evelyn. She waited. And Evelyn Carter, who had spent 7 years being the woman nobody noticed, who had chosen silence with the same deliberateness that she had once chosen the sky, who had built a careful and useful and genuinely meaningful life in the space between who she had been and who the world thought she was. Evelyn Carter looked at the recorder on her desk and made a decision. Not about the story, about the direction. Because Ryan was right that the knowledge had to live in people. And Holman was right that the system needed to look for the people who were carrying it. And Vasquez, crying on a phone call about something he should have done years ago, was right in the way that all regret was right, not as something to dwell in, but as something to learn the right lesson from. The lesson was not that she should have spoken sooner. The lesson was that the speaking when it came should be worth the waiting. She looked at the journalist. "My name," she said, "is Evelyn Carter. My call sign was Ghost. I have been at Falcon Ridge Air Station for 6 years and 11 months. She paused. "This is what I want people to understand." The recorder's light blinked steadily. The afternoon moved. And outside the window on the flight line, where she had spent 7 years not allowing herself to watch the aircraft, continued their endless cycles of departure and return, lifting into the Nevada sky, moving through altitudes and distances that she knew in her body, the way other people knew the streets of the cities they'd grown up in, and then descending, always coming back to the ground that held everything. She talked for a long time. The article published on a Thursday morning, 6 days after Ryan Mitchell landed a dead F-18 on a runway in Nevada. Evelyn did not read it until after she had finished her morning coffee and processed the first two files of the day. She had made that decision deliberately the same way she made most decisions, by deciding in advance what the correct order of things was, and then following that order, regardless of what else was pulling at her attention. The files came first, the coffee came first, the ordinary work of the ordinary morning came first. Because if she let the article be the first thing, she would lose the steadiness she needed to get through whatever came after it. She read it at 7:42. It ran 4,000 words under the headline, "The Pilot Nobody Saw." The journalist had written it the way Evelyn had hoped someone might write it, not as a human interest story about a remarkable woman, not as an outrage piece about institutional failure, but as something more careful and more honest than either of those things. It was a story about systems and the people who fell through the gaps in them. It was a story about the specific and irreplaceable value of experience and the ways that experience went to waste when nobody thought to look for it. It used Evelyn's name and her call sign and a specific and accurate account of what had happened in the control room, and it used that account not as the end of the story, but as the entry point into a much larger question. How many ghosts were out there? How many people with extraordinary knowledge were sitting behind desks at military installations across the country, processing files and correcting data, and never being asked what else they knew? The article ended with a quote from General Patricia Holman, who had agreed to speak to the journalist on the record in a move that Evelyn had not anticipated and that Holman had not warned her about. The quote was brief and precise and carried the particular authority of a three-star general who had decided that something needed to be said publicly. Holman had said, "Captain Carter's case is not unique. It is representative of a systemic failure to track and utilize talent at every level of this force. We are correcting that, and we are starting by acknowledging that we should have corrected it a long time ago." Evelyn read that quote 3 times. Then she closed the article, picked up her pen, and went back to the third file of the morning. By 900 hours, her phone had rung 11 times. She answered 4 of the calls and let the other 7 go to voicemail. The 4 she answered were from people she knew, an old colleague from her flying years who had seen the article and was calling to say something that he couldn't quite find the right words for, and so said several wrong ones in a row until she helped him land on what he actually meant, which was that he was glad she was okay, and that he was sorry, and that he was proud of her in that specific way, that people were proud of people they had known before the hard thing happened. A former instructor who wanted to know if she was going to be in Washington in January, because if she was going to be in Washington in January, he was going to make sure he was in Washington in January. Okafor, who did not say anything for a moment after Evelyn answered, and then simply said the article was right and every word of it was right. And Reed, who called to tell her that his email had 347 unread messages before 9 in the morning, and that 17 of them were from other base commanders. "What do the other base commanders want?" Evelyn asked. "They want to talk to you," Reed said. "Most of them are asking some version of the same question. They want to know how to find their own ghosts." She was quiet for a moment. "And what do you tell them?" "I tell them to start by reading their files," he said. "Actually reading them, not the summary. The file." She heard something in his voice. "How many?" she asked. "How many what?" "How many bases have already found someone since the review started?" A pause. "Holman's office sent me a preliminary count this morning." She waited. 31, he said. 31 people at installations across Air Combat Command with operational flight experience, currently serving in non-flight administrative roles. Some of them are there by choice. Some of them are there because nobody thought to offer them anything else. 31. The number sat in Evelyn's chest in a way she hadn't expected, not as a statistic, but as 31 specific human beings, each carrying something that the force had lost track of, each with their own version of the small office, in the window, in the morning coffee, in the 7 years of silence. "What happens to them now?" she said. "That depends on each individual situation," Reed said. "Some of them may not want anything to change. Some of them may want exactly what you wanted, a path back to the work that uses what they actually know." He paused. "But now at least someone is asking the question." "That's not nothing," she said. "No," he said, "it's not nothing." She hung up. She sat at her desk, And she thought about 31 people waking up this morning and going to their desks at their respective bases and processing their respective files, not yet knowing that someone had counted them. Then the door opened and Ryan Mitchell walked in with 2 cups of coffee, which had become, over the past 6 days, something close to a daily ritual, him appearing at her door at some point in the late morning, coffee in hand, with questions she hadn't anticipated and observations she found herself looking forward to. "You read it," he said, not a question. He could see it in her face. "I read it." He set the coffee on her desk and sat in the chair. 31, he said. "I saw the number from Holman's office." She looked at him. "You have sources." "Okafor tells me things," he said without apology. "She thinks I need to understand the full picture." "She's right," Evelyn said. She picked up the coffee. "What else did Okafor tell you?" "That Price submitted a formal recommendation to the personnel office yesterday. A standing review protocol, every base in Air Combat Command, mandatory annual review of all civilian specialists with prior military flight experience. Not just the ones currently flagged, but ongoing. So it doesn't happen again." Ryan paused. "He put your name in the citation section. He said the protocol was developed in response to the Falcon Ridge incident and specifically to the example of your case." Evelyn was very still. "Price submitted that," she said, "yesterday afternoon." She looked at the window for a moment. She thought about Price in her office doorway, with his cover under his arm and his rehearsed apology, and the question he'd asked 3 seconds, you said, and the specific quality of a man who was trying to understand something he had previously been certain he already understood. "Good," she said finally. Ryan looked at her. "That's all you have to say about it?" "What else should I say?" "I don't know, maybe something about the fact that the man who grabbed a headset out of your hands a week ago just put your name in a formal recommendation as the example of what the Air Force was doing wrong and needs to do right." She looked at him steadily. "People change," she said. "When they're given information they didn't have, and when they're honest enough to do something with it." She paused. "That's not a small thing. Don't make it small by being surprised by it." He absorbed that. "You're not angry at him anymore," Ryan said. "I was never primarily angry," she said. "I was briefly very focused on getting back to the radio channel." She took a sip of coffee. "Anger is a thing that helps you in specific moments. Beyond those moments, it mostly gets in the way of the work." He shook his head slowly. "I've been thinking about that," he said. "About what you said, that anger is for specific moments and then you let it go. I've been trying to figure out how you do that, how you develop that." "You don't develop it," she said. "You choose it every time." She set down the cup. "It's not a trait, it's a practice. You have to choose it in the moment when everything in you wants to do the opposite, and you have to choose it again the next time, and eventually the choosing becomes faster." She looked at him. "But it never becomes automatic. Don't let anyone tell you it becomes automatic." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I got my flight clearance back this morning. Flight surgeon cleared me for full duty." She looked at him. "How do you feel about that?" "I thought I'd feel ready," he said honestly. "I thought after 6 days of processing it and talking it through and getting the medical clearance, I'd feel ready to get back in the aircraft." He paused. "I don't entirely feel ready. I feel like I'm going to get in the aircraft and be ready once I'm actually in it. Does that make sense?" "Yes," she said immediately. "That's exactly what ready feels like. If you waited until you felt completely ready before getting back in, you'd wait forever." She looked at him directly. "The readiness is in the doing, not in the feeling before you do it." He nodded slowly. "Is that what it was like for you after your last flight?" She looked at him for a moment. "No," she said, "because there was no getting back in for me. The readiness I was working with was different, not readiness to fly again, but readiness to do something else with what I knew." She paused. "That took longer, and it arrived in a different way. Not as a feeling of being ready, as the inability to justify waiting any longer." He held her gaze. "And that's where you are now." "That's where I am now," she said. He stood up. He picked up his empty cup. He looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize over the past 6 days as the one that meant he had more to say, but was choosing his moment. "They're talking about naming something after you," he said. "The training protocol, the new simulator curriculum. Someone in Holman's office suggested calling it the Carter Protocol." She stared at him. "I'm telling you now," he said, "because I figured you'd rather hear it from me than from a memo." She opened her mouth, closed it. I don't want anything named after me, she said. I know, he said, but it might happen anyway. He moved to the door, then stopped because it was what he did. Ghost, he looked back at her. If they name it something else, if they call it the Emergency Recovery Instructor Program or the Advanced Procedures Protocol or whatever language works for them, what would you want it to teach, the core of it, the thing that can't be in a manual? She looked at him. She thought about Ryan falling from 22,000 feet with no engines. She thought about her own final flight, the choices made in the last 40 seconds before ejection. She thought about Okafor stepping in front of Price and about Price sitting in the chair across her desk, and about Holman's voice saying people who deserve recognition rarely ask for it. She thought about 31 people at 31 desks across Air Combat Command and what it would mean to find them, to tell them they had been counted, to ask them what they were carrying. That the sky is not the enemy, she said. When everything fails, when the engines are gone and the instruments are wrong, and every number is telling you that you're finished, the sky is not the enemy. The sky is the medium you work in. The problem is specific and the problem is solvable, and your job is to stay present long enough to solve it. She paused. And that you are never as alone as you feel in that moment, because there are people on the ground who are thinking about your problem and who have thought about problems like yours before. And finding those people, knowing they exist, knowing how to reach them, that is as important as any technical skill you will ever learn. Ryan stood in the doorway and looked at her. That's the curriculum, he said quietly. That's the curriculum, she agreed. He left. The morning moved toward noon. At 11:15, three things happened. The first was that Evelyn received a text message from a number she didn't recognize, which read, I heard you're teaching now. Good. It's been too late for a long time, but better late. Call me when you have a minute. It was signed with a first initial and a last name, and it was the name of a pilot she had flown with 14 years ago, who she had believed had left the aviation world entirely and gone into commercial real estate in Texas. The second was that two pilots she had never spoken to, a captain and a first lieutenant, both young, both clearly having coordinated their arrival in advance, knocked on her door together and asked if they could ask her some questions about emergency procedures, and she said yes. And they spent 40 minutes in her office, and she did not look at the clock once. The third was a phone call from Vasquez. Not the message through Ryan, not a text, a direct call on his personal cell to her cell, which meant Ryan had passed her number along, which she had not authorized but also did not regret. She stepped out into the corridor to take it. Evelyn. His voice was older than she remembered. Of course it was older, she had not heard it in 14 years. But underneath the age, it was the same voice with the same quality that had always characterized it, genuine and direct, and slightly unguarded in a way that not many fighter pilots allowed themselves to be. Vasquez, she said. A brief silence. I heard your voice when Ryan played me the recording, he said, from the radio channel. Someone in Holman's office cleared it for limited sharing, and Ryan had a copy and he played it for me. Another silence. You sound exactly the same. She stood in the corridor and held the phone and felt something that was large and complicated and did not have a simple name. You sound older, she said. He laughed. It was a real laugh, surprised and genuine. I am older. So are you. A pause. I owe you something. You owe me a phone call, she said. You made it. I owe you more than that. Ryan told me what he found in the commendation record. 3 recoveries before the last flight. His voice was careful now, the way it got when he was saying something he had thought about for a long time. I knew about 2 of them. I didn't know about the third. And when I heard about it, all 3 of them laid out like that, I kept thinking about the fact that when I told that story in the pilot lounge, I told it like you were a legend, like you were something from the past. And the whole time you were correcting maintenance logs, she said. I should have found you, he said. I had the means to find you, and I didn't use them, and I don't have a good reason for that, except that I got busy and time moved, and I told myself the story had already been written. He paused. I'm sorry, Evelyn. She stood in the corridor and she held the phone and she thought about what she had told Ryan, that anger was for specific moments, and beyond those moments, it got in the way of the work. Here's what I want you to do with that apology, she said. I want you to take it and turn it into something concrete. You have connections I don't have. You have 30 years of relationships in this community. Find the ghost on your end. Find the people you know who ended up in places that aren't using what they know. Make noise about them the way you should have made noise about me. A silence. You're giving me homework, he said. I'm giving you a purpose, she said. There's a difference. Another silence, longer this time, and she heard something moving through it that she recognized because she had felt it herself in the past 6 days. The specific quality of a person realizing that the thing they were sorry about could be transformed into something that mattered more than the apology itself. All right, he said. All right, Evelyn, I'll make noise. Good, she said. Call me in a month and tell me what you found. She hung up. She went back into her office. She sat at her desk. She looked at the routing slip for the instructor position, still sitting in the corner of her desk where she had placed it 6 days ago. The formal processing was nearly complete. Reed's assistant had confirmed that the certification waiver, which required documentation of her real-world emergency experience in lieu of current simulator instructor certification, had been approved at the command level. She was, in the language of Air Force Personnel Administration, approximately 4 signatures away from having a different job title. 4 signatures, 7 years. She picked up the pen. She had 3 more files to process before the end of the day. She did them in order with the same precision and care she had brought to every file for 6 years and 11 months, because the work was the work and it mattered, and that had not changed. At 1300, the door opened without a knock, and she looked up, expecting Ryan. It was not Ryan. It was a woman she had met once briefly at a personnel briefing 2 years ago, Major Sandra Chen, the current head of the base's training coordination office. Chen was efficient and direct and had the specific quality of someone who managed large amounts of information without losing track of any of it. She had a folder in her hand and an expression that said she had been working toward this conversation for at least the past 24 hours. Miss Carter, Chen said, do you have 10 minutes? Sit down, Evelyn said. Chen sat. She opened the folder. She set it on the desk between them. The simulator curriculum, Chen said. I've been asked to coordinate the development of the new module, the emergency procedures component, that will be built around your framework. General Holman's office wants a preliminary structure by the end of the month. She looked at Evelyn directly. I want to build it with you, not around you, with you. Evelyn looked at the folder. She looked at Chen. What's the timeline? She said. Aggressive, Chen said. They want the first cohort going through the simulator curriculum in 8 weeks. 8 weeks is very fast for a curriculum development process. I know, but there are pilots going up right now who don't have this framework, and every day that the curriculum doesn't exist is a day that it could matter that it doesn't exist. Evelyn heard the logic of that immediately because it was the same logic she had applied to maintenance log corrections for 7 years. The errors that nobody noticed were still errors, and the cost of them was real whether anyone could see it or not. What do you need from me? She said. Everything, Chen said simply. Every decision point, every non-intuitive choice, every moment in an emergency where your experience told you something different from what the instrument said. I want to map those moments, and I want to build a framework around them that other pilots can learn. She paused. I want to take what's in your head and make it transmissible. Transmissible. It was exactly the right word, and Evelyn recognized it as exactly the right word, and the recognition settled something in her chest that had been slightly unsettled since the morning of the emergency. The question of whether what she knew could be taught, whether the specific and embodied nature of her experience was something that could be passed along, or whether it was simply and permanently personal. Transmissible. Okay, she said, let's start now. Chin looked slightly surprised. Now, I thought we could schedule. You said 8 weeks and you said it was aggressive, Evelyn said. So let's start now. Chen reached into her folder and pulled out a blank notepad and a pen. She was smiling, not a large smile, but the particular smile of someone who had expected to spend 10 minutes making a request and was now suddenly beginning the actual work. Okay, she said. Tell me about the first time you knew something that your instruments didn't. Evelyn looked at her and she began. She talked for 2 hours and 14 minutes without stopping, except to answer clarifying questions. She talked about specific emergencies and specific decisions and the specific quality of information that came from physical experience inside a failing aircraft at altitude, information that no instrument panel could give you because it lived in the hands and the body and the accumulated weight of hours spent paying attention to things most pilots were trained to automate. She talked about what it felt like to know with confidence something that looked wrong on paper, and how that confidence was not arrogance, but data. Data stored in a format that had no technical name. Data accumulated over years of asking the next question when the standard answer wasn't enough. Chin wrote continuously. She never stopped writing. At 15:14, Ryan knocked on the door, the knock that had become recognizable to Evelyn in the past 6 days, direct and unhesitating, and opened it and stopped when he saw Chen sitting across the desk with a notepad that was nearly full. "I'll come back," he said. "No," Evelyn said. "Come in, sit down." He came in. He looked at Chen. He looked at the notepad. He sat in the second chair that had appeared in her office sometime in the past week, placed there by someone who had noticed the traffic of visitors and made a practical adjustment without being asked. "Chen is building the curriculum," Evelyn said. Ryan looked at Chen. "What do you have so far?" Chen looked at her notepad and then looked at Ryan with the expression of someone who was still processing the size of what they had been given. 11 non-intuitive decision points, she said, each one with a specific scenario, a specific instrument, reading a specific physical indicator that contradicts the reading and the decision pathway for each outcome. She paused. "It's the most concentrated body of practical emergency knowledge I've encountered in 13 years of curriculum development." Ryan looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked back at him without expression. "I told you," he said. "You told me." "Oh," she said. Chen looked between them. "There's something else," she said, and her voice shifted slightly, the shift of someone moving from the professional conversation to the one underneath it. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that it's not part of the official curriculum development." "This is me asking." "Ask," Evelyn said. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Chen said. "I mean the people on this base, your colleagues. Why did you spend 7 years not telling the people you worked with every day who you were?" The office was quiet. Ryan went very still. Evelyn looked at Chen, and then she looked at the window, and then she looked back at Chen, and she said the things she had been saying in different formulations to different people all week, and that she had not yet found the exact right words for, but that she was getting closer to every time. "Because I wasn't sure it still mattered," she said, "who I had been, what I had done. After the injury, after the flying ended, I didn't know how to carry the identity of who I was in the air while living the life I was living on the ground." She paused. "So I put it down. I told myself I put it down because it was modest, because I wasn't the kind of person who needed to be recognized. But that wasn't entirely honest." She held Chen's gaze. "The honest reason was that I was afraid. If I told people who I had been, and they looked at me the way people look at something that used to be significant with that particular kind of polite, diminished regard, I would have had to feel that every day." Another pause. "It was easier to be nobody than to be someone who used to be somebody." Chen was very still. "And now," she said. "Now," Evelyn said, "I understand something that I should have understood earlier. The pilot I was and the person I am right now are not two separate things. They were never two separate things. I made them separate because it was easier to manage the grief that way." She looked at the window one more time. "I'm done making them separate." Chen looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked down at her notepad. She wrote something at the top of the first page. She turned it so Evelyn could read it. She had written transmissible, and underneath it, all of it. The afternoon moved towards 1600. Chen left at 1540 with a notepad that was full and a promise to return tomorrow with a structured draft of the first 3 modules. Ryan stayed for another 20 minutes asking the questions he'd been accumulating, and Evelyn answered them with the same precision and patience she brought to everything, not because the patience came naturally in all moments, but because she had decided it was the correct approach and she followed the decision. When Ryan left, she sat at her desk in the quiet of the late afternoon and she thought about the week. She thought about the headset in her hands and the cord against her jaw and the 40 seconds of silence and Ryan's voice breaking on the channel. She thought about Price in her doorway and Holman's voice on the phone and the journalist with the recorder on the desk. She thought about Chen's notepad and Vasquez's phone call and 31 people at 31 desks who had been counted. She thought about what it meant to have been found. Not rescued, not restored to something that had been taken, but found the way things were found when someone finally looked in the right place at the right time, when the emergency was specific enough to make the question unavoidable when the system was finally forced to ask who else was in the building. She thought about the pilot she had been and the woman she was now, and the things she had told Chen about those two not being separate. She believed it, not because the past week had resolved everything, or because the grief of what she had lost was gone, or because 7 years of silence had been retroactively transformed into something meaningful just by the fact of this week arriving. None of that was true. The injury was the same. The years were the same. The mornings she had spent at this desk not watching the planes were the same. But the direction was different now. And direction she had learned in the air, in the long silence after, and in everything that had happened since. A 26-year-old pilot screamed a name that had almost become a myth. Direction was everything. She stood up. She put on her jacket. She gathered the last 2 files of the day into her bag to finish at home, not because she couldn't do them here, but because she wanted to go outside. She wanted to walk across the tarmac in the late November afternoon and feel the direction of the wind and watch the aircraft on the flight line and not pretend that she wasn't watching. She opened the door. Reed was standing in the corridor. He was not in his service uniform. He was in his utility uniform, which meant the official part of his day was done. He was holding a piece of paper and he was looking at it with an expression she couldn't read from the doorway. "Marcus," she said. He looked up. "The 4th signature came through," he said. He held out the paper. She took it. It was the personnel action form, fully signed and routing, complete, approved at every level from base to command. It contained her name and her new position title and the effective date, which was the following Monday. Advanced Emergency Procedures Instructor, Falcon Ridge Air Station. She held the paper and she read it twice. And Reed, who had known her for 3 years and who had made the decision in a moment of crisis that had changed the direction of both their lives, looked at her with the expression of a man who understood. He was watching something that he had the privilege of witnessing, but could not add to by speaking. So he didn't speak. He just stood there and let her read it. She read it a 3rd time. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her jacket pocket and looked at Reed. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," he said. "I just signed the paper." She looked at him steadily. "You gave me the headset," she said. "In a room full of people who were hesitating, you gave me the headset. That matters." He held her gaze. "Go home, Evelyn," he said quietly. "You've had a long week." She walked past him down the corridor. She walked out of the operations building into the Nevada evening, and the cold hit her face the way it always did in November, dry and sharp and immediate. She stood on the tarmac for a moment, and she felt the direction of the wind, which was northwest as it usually was at this hour, at this time of year. She looked at the flight line. An F-18 was on final approach navigation, lights blinking, gear down, descending toward the runway with the practiced precision of a pilot who had made this approach many times. She watched it come down. She watched the flare. She watched the gear touch the runway and the aircraft decelerate and the tailhook catch and the whole long control process of a thing in motion becoming a thing at rest. She watched it all. She stood on the tarmac of Falcon Ridge Air Station on a Thursday evening in November, and she watched a pilot land an aircraft, and she felt what she felt, not grief, not longing, not the ghost ache of what had been taken. She felt the clean, specific satisfaction of someone who understood exactly what had just happened and why it had happened and what it had cost and what it was worth. She knew this, all of it, every variable, every decision point, every non-intuitive choice between the sky and the ground. She knew it in her hands and in her body and in the accumulated weight of everything she had carried through 7 years of silence and one extraordinary morning in a control room when a young pilot screamed a name that almost nobody remembered. She knew it, and starting Monday, she was going to teach it. She put her hands in her pockets and she walked to her car, and the Nevada sky above her was enormous and dark and full of stars that she had once moved through at the speed of sound, and that now held her as the sky always held everything that happened beneath it, steady and permanent and entirely without judgment. Ghost did not disappear twice.